Hey everybody. I'm super happy that we're going to launch into a new symposium today. I mean, last week was sort of a spiritual manifesto of what we're going to be going through over the course of the coming weeks ahead. There will be an inauguration of President Trump 2.0 on Monday. And what I've noticed is that there is a robust curiosity that I've not seen in a very long time over the better traditions, the lost traditions of the United States and the American system of political economy, which is coinciding with this potential transformation of the United States towards something which is not animated by a principle of death and depopulation. So, with all of the problems that one might identify, there is definitely a sense that there is hope that I think is well grounded. We have also a series of foreign policy initiatives that we've seen announced, one of which being that Trump will be visiting on an early, perhaps his first state visit to a foreign leader. He will be visiting up with Xi Jinping. We know also that the vice premier of China will be present at the inauguration. There is discussion now for dialogue, constructive dialogue, and compromise that we haven't seen under the more rigid technocratic script that demands entire obedience and hegemony. So we're seeing that on a variety of fronts. And of course, there are problematic creatures, vipers, deep state structures that should not be ignored. With that being said, the hunger is real. And so we thought, what would be more appropriate than to satisfy that hunger with real knowledge? The hunger of the soul is discovery and the acting upon said discovery to change our world for the better. We are on the verge of some very potential calamitous transformations as well that could see humanity plunge into a very dark place for many generations if we're not wise. So Sam and I were talking about what to do going into this new dynamic. And so the idea of a series of classes showcasing the better historic traditions of the American system. What is it? How did it work? When did leading American presidents rise up who chose to accept the challenge um, of really acting on the stage of history as non-tragic beings, even at the risk of losing their lives for the sake of their conscience and their knowledge? So what were those case studies that we could glean from and then act upon today as we navigate through the storm? So Sam is somebody who's done an immense amount of work on this topic, on history. He's got a great Substack that I encourage everyone to follow. The link will be in the description box as well. Sam's previous lectures on Colbertism, the cameralist pre-American system history are invaluable resources that go from Leibniz to Jean-Baptiste Colbert and Benjamin Franklin, all of that. I'll make a few of those classes available. So today we're going to continue those threads that Sam has laid in his previous lectures by going through the protective system, its principle, and its historical effect in shaping our world for the better. So Sam, without further ado, it's all yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you to everybody for being here. And thanks, Matt, for this opportunity. I will share my screen and we can get started. All right, guys. So again, thank you everybody for being here. President Trump is being inaugurated tomorrow, and I've started working on a series of articles called Trump, Tariffs and Treason, Return to the True Economic Heritage of the United States. A lot of us are aware of Trump's advocacy for tariffs. The inclusion of treason in the title might confuse some people, but I hope that by the end of this lecture, it's a lot more clear why the word treason is included. So, as I said, I've started a series of articles called Trump's Tariffs and Treason on my Substack, which is called Overcoming Oligarchy. It's a Substack I had the idea to start for a little while now, and actually this idea for a series of articles was the impetus for me to finally start it. The question of how do we overcome oligarchy as a society is probably my biggest animating principle, the biggest question that I wrestle with on a constant basis. So, the impetus for the idea for this series came from seeing this exchange with Donald Trump at the Bloomberg conference at the Economic Club of Chicago.
GDP. This is a very business-like audience. Yeah. Why should they trust you with that?
Because we're about growth. She's got no growth whatsoever, and we're all about growth. We're going to bring companies back to our country. You look at even today, as I was driving over, I see these empty, old, beautiful, like steel mills and factories that are empty and falling down. Some have been converted to senior citizens' homes, but that's not going to do the trick. And we're going to bring the companies back. We're going to lower taxes still further for companies that are going to make their product in the USA. We're going to protect those companies with strong tariffs, because I'm a believer in tariffs. I'm not sure that you are. I don't think you are, but I congratulate you in your career. But to me, the most beautiful word in the dictionary is tariff. And it's my favorite word. It needs a public relations firm to help it, but to me, it's the most beautiful word in the dictionary.
Tariffs, do you think?
So the British editor of Bloomberg freak out at the advocacy for tariffs. I really liked. I mean, my whole life. I mean, I was born in the '80s, so I've been through the deregulation of Reagan into Clinton, which was ostensibly a Democrat, but really he was a moderate Republican. George Bush, the Iraq War, continued deregulation, globalization, free trade, NAFTA, free trade area of the Americas, into Obama and the promise of Obama and the complete, betrayal of Obama, the total, letdown that Obama was. Um, so to hear this, as somebody who met Matt in Montreal in 2009 and was given the documentary 1932 by him, which just completely changed my outlook, my worldview, um, and really converted me to the Lincoln Republican idea of protectionism and tariffs and technological progress, industrialization, from, previously being very greeny, left wing, anti-development type guy. To hear this from Trump was just, a huge shock to me. And obviously, I loved it. And, my question is, um, where does this tariff understanding of Trump come from? I don't know, actually. I've tried to find this out. I'm not sure if it's something Trump knows himself or if he has people around him who are pushing this on him. I have a few theories, like maybe Roger Stone, because I know Roger Stone has done work with the Schiller Institute in the past. But I'm really not sure. And if anybody knows anything about that, I would love to hear from you more on that topic. And in this presentation, this is going to be a wide ranging presentation, and there's going to necessarily be things that we sort of jump through quickly. Um, if you are particularly knowledgeable on one point and you feel like I've left something out that is pertinent to what we're discussing here today, please feel free to interrupt, to turn your mic on and say something. I really want this to be more of a discussion. I want to be talking with you more than talking at you. And all of this is part of my research for this series of articles as well. So if you have anything to add, please feel free. So let's get started. I'm going to divide this up into three sections: the past, the present, and the future. Where are we going from here? So starting with the past, in the past, 100% of the presidents who have been shot at were pro-development. They were not necessarily pro-tariff. Even when they weren't pro-tariff, though, the cardinal sin that makes them a target is being pro-development, pro-growth, pro-industrial progress, pro-technological progress, pro-team humanity. So here is where I'm going to start from in American history. And if you've seen some of my previous lectures on Leibniz and Colbert and the Massachusetts Bay Colony, you'll know that there's even precursors that are in American history that go before this. But I've chosen to start at Ben Franklin. And here's a scene from scene at the signing of the Constitution of the United States by Howard Chandler Christie. And this is Ben Franklin and Alexander Hamilton seated together, and Hamilton talking in the ear of Franklin. And there's not a lot of correspondence or known overlap between Franklin and Hamilton. So what is it that unites these two men? And two big factors which unite them are Tench Coxe and Aimé de Vattel, who de Vattel I've previously talked about in the first lecture I did for Rising Tide Foundation on Leibniz, Colbert, and Vattel. So Ben Franklin, he published many economic tracts throughout his lifetime, even going back to 1729 with his necessity of a paper currency. And as I showed in the Massachusetts Bay Colony talk that I did, it even goes back further to Ben Franklin's mentor, Cotton Mather. Ben Franklin also, he was really the impetus for the Industrial Revolution in England. And so he founded the Lunar Society in England, and the circles around Ben Franklin's Lunar Society were people who were instrumental in bringing industrialization to England, completely contrary to the typical British liberal historical analysis that we get. So on May 11th, 1787, there was a meeting for the Society for Political Inquiries, which was convened at Ben Franklin's house, with this anonymous pamphlet, an inquiry into the principles on which a commercial system for the United States of America should be founded. And the author in the pamphlet was given as anonymous, but the author was actually Tench Coxe, and Tench Coxe was a protege of Ben Franklin. He was from Philadelphia, and he stood up in the home of Ben Franklin to read the pamphlet with the rest of the society. And Tench Coxe went on in the George Washington administration to be the Deputy Secretary of the Treasury under Alexander Hamilton. And so the second influence that I mentioned was Vattel. Vattel had a huge impact on Alexander Hamilton from the book, the biography by Forrest MacDonald. Vattel's work was truly Hamilton's kind of book. Vattel altered Hamilton's conception of the proper functions of government, or rather provided him a system of ideas more congruent with his instinct than was the Lockean doctrine that government existed only to preserve natural rights to life, liberty, and property. Vattel described the principal objects of good government under three main heads: to provide for the nation's necessities, to procure the true happiness of the nation, and to fortify itself against external attacks. In regards to the objectives of government, Hamilton's views were also unorthodox, paralleling as they did the ideas of Vattel. Virtually every member of the convention held that one primary end of government was the protection of liberty, and agreed with Madison's Lockean statement that the other primary objects of civil society, and thus of government, are the security of property and public safety. Hamilton took a much more positive position. Paraphrasing Vattel, he declared that the ends of government were three: providing for the great purposes of commerce, revenue, and agriculture; facilitating domestic tranquility and happiness; and three, establishing sufficient stability and strength to make us respectable abroad. In the notes to the book, you can see Hamilton cited number of authorities in the case Rutgers versus Waddington, but he drew most heavily upon Vattel. He never cited Christian Wolff, who in fact influenced Vattel greatly. Christian Wolff I talked about in the Leibniz lecture. Wolff had drawn heavily on Leibniz, that's absolutely true, as well as Vattel. Vattel, his very first thing that he wrote was a defense of Leibniz. And we know that Hamilton first read Vattel in 1782. This is the book in question, the Law of Nations by Vattel. And we can see here some excerpts from it, which could almost be Hamilton's report on manufacturers. Section 84, the home trade of a nation is of great use. It furnishes all the citizens with the means of procuring whatever they want as either necessary, useful, or agreeable. It causes a circulation of money, excites industry, animates labor, and by affording subsistence to a great number of people, contributes to increase the population and power of the state. Nations are obliged to cultivate the home trade. First, because it is clearly demonstrated from the law of nature that mankind ought mutually to assist each other, and as far as in their power, contribute to the perfection and happiness of their fellow creatures, whence arises, after the introduction of private property, the obligation to resign to others at a fair price those things which they have occasion for and which we do not destine for our own use. Second, society being established with the view that each may procure whatever things are necessary to his own perfection and happiness, and a home trade being the means of obtaining them, the obligations to carry on and improve this trade are derived from the very compact on which the society was formed. Finally, being advantageous to the nation, it is a duty the people owe to themselves to make this commerce flourish. Every state has consequently a right to prohibit the entrance of foreign merchandises, and the nations that are affected by such prohibition have no right to complain of it, as if they had been refused an office of humanity. Their complaints would be ridiculous, since their only ground of complaint would be that a profit is refused to them by that nation, who does not choose they should make it at her expense. Let us only observe that nations as well as individuals are obliged to trade together for the common benefit of the human race, because mankind stand in need of each other's assistance. Still, however, each nation remains at liberty to consider, in particular cases, whether it be convenient for her to encourage or permit commerce, and as our duty to ourselves is paramount to our duty to others, if one nation finds herself in such circumstances that she thinks foreign commerce dangerous to the state, she may renounce and prohibit it. This the Chinese have done for a long time together, but again, it is only for very serious and important reasons that her duty to herself should dictate such a reserve. Otherwise, she could not refuse to comply with the general duties of humanity. So, as said before, Hamilton's report on manufacturers is published in 1791. It's a report to Congress, and it was co-authored with Tench Coxe, Ben Franklin's protege. This is from the 5th printing in the preface, and it says, "There's one maxim in his book which ought to be posted in letters of gold. Whatever tends to diminish in any country the number of artificers and manufacturers tends to diminish the home market, the most important of all markets, for the rude produce of the soil, and thereby still further to discourage agriculture. This sound maxim may be fairly said to be the alpha and omega, the law and the prophets as regards political economy." So Hamilton, he's often thought of in terms of protectionism or tariffs, and he certainly did encourage tariffs. We're going to go through, he had a number of suggestions in his report. We're going to go through all of them because, Trump, in addition to tariffs, has in the American system's tradition other options available to him as well. So he advocates one for protecting duties on those foreign articles which are the rivals of the domestic ones intended to be encouraged. Number 2, prohibition of rival articles or duties equivalent to prohibitions. Number 3, prohibitions on the exportation of the materials of manufacturers. So if the home market needs them, don't export them to other countries, keep them to build up your home market. Number 4, pecuniary bounties. So he gives here bounties and premiums, which are two related things, but not exactly the same. He says bounties have not, like high protecting duties, a tendency to produce scarcity. And there's a degree of prejudice against bounties from an appearance of giving away the public money without an immediate consideration, and from a supposition that they serve to enrich particular classes at the expense of the community. But neither of these sources of dislike will bear a serious examination. There is no purpose to which public money can be more beneficially applied than to the acquisition of a new and useful branch of industry, no consideration more valuable than a permanent addition to the general stock of productive labor. Number 5, he lists premiums. These are of nature allied to bounties, though distinguishable from them in some important features. They are applicable to the whole quantity of an article produced or manufactured or exported and involve a correspondent expense. Premiums serve to reward some particular excellence or superiority. Number 6, the exemption of materials of manufacturers from duty. And this I find a crucial point which previous American system leaders understood, and which I'm concerned with Trump's threats of general tariffs on everything, threatening, 25% tariff on everything. That's not a protective tariff. That's not the typical American system of people like Hamilton and Lincoln and McKinley, who Trump speaks admiringly of often. Number 7, the drawbacks of the duties which are imposed on the materials of manufacturers. So if there's already duties on materials being used by manufacturers, to lower them. Number 8, the encouragement of new inventions and discoveries at home, and of the introduction into the United States of such as may have been made in other countries, particularly those which relate to machinery. Now, this is, of course, the 1790s, but the encouragement of new inventions and discoveries, I mean, that can apply even today to, crash programs for, very advanced technology that we don't have yet, but which we deem that we could do, which the private sector is unwilling or unable to fund, but which would be of enormous benefit to humanity. Number 9, judicious regulations for the inspection of manufactured commodities. So, setting up regulations to ensure quality of the manufacturers. And the facilitating of pecuniary remittances from place to place, which is just a fancy term for like bills of credit. And he says down here, general circulation of bank paper, which is to be expected from the institution lately established, will be a most valuable means to this end. The institution he's referring to was the first bank of the United States, set up under George Washington. And the facilitating of the transportation of commodities, so transportation improvements, what is now called infrastructure development throughout American history, was often called internal improvements. Transportation improvements, Hamilton called the greatest of all possible improvements. So we have Hamilton and George Washington. We have a highly successful period of time in the 1790s. And Hamilton has to resign for personal reasons from the cabinet. John Adams comes in. He's a Federalist in 1797, though not quite as capable of a cabinet. Things are still on a decent trajectory until 1801 and the election of Thomas Jefferson, who brings in Swiss banker Albert Gallatin as the Secretary of the Treasury. And Gallatin was a pure free trader. It's funny, actually. I found this, which Gallatin was forced to make this report to the Secretary of the report of the Secretary of Treasury to the Senate in 1807 on the development of public roads and canals. And he was actually made to do this by John Quincy Adams in the Senate. And he listed a bunch of improvements that could be done. But of course, after the report was submitted, absolutely nothing was done towards that end. And the report just died. Let's see a few charts. These are taken from the book The Economic Growth of the United States, 1790 to 1860 by Douglas C. North. So you can see the value of exports from 1790 to 1800 rising pretty, aggressively. And starting in 1801, we have a crash and then a recovery. And around 1807, a huge crash in the value of exports under the Thomas Jefferson administration. You also see the export price index reference to 1790 being 100%. The price of exports rising, so manufacturing improving and more valuable goods being made, and then again crashing towards 1800 and continuing down throughout the administrations of Thomas Jefferson. The terms of trade as well, which is a comparison between exports and imports, which is generally that an increasing terms of trade is considered a good thing. You see terms of trade initially goes down, but then rapidly rises throughout the 1790s. And then again, 1800s starts to decline. In 1804, Aaron Burr murders Alexander Hamilton, which is a really perfect metaphor for the fight between these two systems. So you have Aaron Burr, the con man, the Anglophile, marries into the Swiss British elite family of the Provost, the Malay Provost, and runs this scam in Manhattan. He raises all this money to start a Manhattan company, um, which was supposed to deliver water to the city of Manhattan, with a clause in the contract that says any unused funds can be used for banking. And then he does almost nothing to provide water and starts what's known as the Bank of Manhattan, later becoming Chase Manhattan, later merging with JP Morgan, becoming JP Morgan Chase. So here you have the one of the founders of the Wall Street speculator class murdering the pro-industrial Alexander Hamilton. So I consider it a really great metaphor. So we have then the War of 1812 comes. The War of 1812 was particularly useful in showing the weakness of the previous 12 years of Jefferson and Madison, that they reduced tariffs. Right before the war broke out, they did not renew the charter for the first Bank of the United States, so they got rid of national banking. And the War of 1812 was a big disaster for the United States. And the Federalist Party was completely discredited. The Federalist Party ran something called the Hartford Convention, which they were advocating for the breakup of the United States. And then, of course, right after that, the U.S. wins the War of 1812, and the Federalist Party is completely discredited. So we go into what's now called the era of good feelings, starting with President Monroe. And it was called that because pretty much everyone in America was in the same party. So you had factions within the party, but everyone was united around what was called the Democratic Republican Party. The Federalist Party was a broken entity. It hardly existed after the Hartford Convention. And immediately, Monroe raises tariffs. He restores the Bank of the United States with the Second Bank of the United States. And we begin to move into the 1820s with a renewed optimism. The economy is doing great, and industrialization is increasing again. The encouragement of manufacturers. So here's a picture of the second bank of the United States in Philadelphia. The Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander James Dallas, was a co-leader of the Pennsylvania Democratic Republican Party with Matthew Carey. Matthew Carey was an Irishman who was another protege of Ben Franklin in Philadelphia. And here we see President Monroe's cabinet, including John Quincy Adams as Secretary of State, Alexander James Dallas, the Pennsylvania ally of Matthew Carey, Secretary of the Treasury, and Speaker of the House is Henry Clay. Henry Clay is often given credit for the term the American system. He was a very vocal advocate for the American system policies. So 1820s, Marquis de Lafayette does his famous return to America, visiting in America. Here's a portrait of him done by Samuel Morse in 1826. And here's a sketch of his welcoming parade in Philadelphia. He had, huge parades every town he went to. And Friedrich List, who was highly influenced by Hamilton, he served as a translator for Lafayette on his American visit. And then he settles down in Pennsylvania with this industrialist faction. He lives there for 8 years, from 1824 to 1832, and then he returns to Germany. A quote by him: before the Pennsylvania Society for the Promotion of Manufactures and the Mechanic Arts in 1827, I herewith declare war against the system of Adam Smith on behalf of the American system of political economy. So here we see this in the 1820s, this Pennsylvania triumvirate with Friedrich List, Matthew Carey, and then Nicholas Biddle, who is running the second bank of the United States. And then we go into the presidency of John Quincy Adams. Again, we see Henry Clay. He's brought in as Secretary of State, and Secretary of Treasury Richard Rush, another key ally. John Quincy Adams, famously known for his 1826 speech, which he said, America does not go abroad in search of monsters to destroy. And this is going to be a recurring theme we're going to see, that these American system leaders, they're not just pro-development, they're also pro-peace. And I think that that has a nice tie over to President Trump and his assertions that he's going to be the president of peace, that he wants to end the endless wars, the useless wars, and bring the peace dividend back home. So here we can see in the non-grayed out portion 1820 to 1830, and we can see tariffs throughout this period rising substantially. And under President John Quincy Adams, there was a number of internal improvements that were started. The National Road, the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal, Chesapeake and Delaware Canal, Louisville and Portland Canal, Dismal Swamp Canal, and the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, the B&O you might know from Monopoly game. That was the first U.S. passenger railroad. Many people might know, 1828, John Quincy Adams is defeated for the presidency by Andrew Jackson. Jackson's campaign was ran by Wall Street banker Martin Van Buren, who was a protege of Aaron Burr. There was rumors as well that Van Buren was actually Aaron Burr's illegitimate son. That's not proven, but that was speculated at the time. And we can see during Jackson's administration into Van Buren's administration, Van Buren was president after Jackson, tariffs dropped precipitously. And not just that, Jackson was a staunch enemy of Henry Clay and John Quincy Adams and the American system. So it wasn't just tariffs, but um, he was also running the bank war, trying to end the um, charter of the second bank of the United States, which he was ultimately successful in doing in 1836. And there's so much fascinating history there of the fight between Henry Clay and John Quincy Adams and others, and Van Buren and Andrew Jackson, that I just don't have time to get into, or this would be like 5 hours long. But yeah, there's a really fascinating history there. This was a troubling, I'll say, quote by President Trump about Andrew Jackson, which I think sort of shows a little misunderstanding by Trump. He says Andrew Jackson was the people's president and that he imposed tariffs on foreign countries to protect American workers. That sounds very familiar. Wait till you see what's going to be happening, folks. Like he's going to impose tariffs. I mean, it's just a backwards understanding. Um, the people Andrew Jackson was fighting against were doing that. Jackson and Van Buren were solidly free traders. Here we have some illustrations of the bank war between Old Hickory and the bully Nick. So this was from a pro-free trade newspaper. The bully Nick being Nicholas Biddle, the guy running the second bank of the United States. And so this whole policy, um, run by Andrew Jackson, Martin Van Buren, they got Roger Taney to remove the deposits from the Bank of the United States, which it was highly questionable. It was illegal what he did, and Jackson actually had to go through two other secretaries of the Treasury who refused to do it. They resigned rather than do it because they said this is illegal what you're asking me to do. But Taney had no compunction about it and did it. Taney later on was the author of the very infamous Dred Scott decision in the 1850s, where he said that no black person could ever be a citizen of the United States, which was a very important development in the antebellum period, the period leading up to the Civil War. And so Van Buren comes in, and there's this huge panic. It's one of the biggest depressions in American history, the Panic of 1837, with these economic policies. Um, Tons of factories closed, credit dried up, and you can just see cartoon after cartoon of the hard times um, from this era. Just nothing to eat, no money coming in. It was a really, really terrible time. And um, there was some wins back and forth from here up until 1860. But in general, this was a period where tariffs, you can see here leading up, tariffs generally, you see a little bit here. Um, there was a win in the middle of the 1840s, but in general, tariffs continued their decline up until 1860. And you had this rise of this treason faction in the United States, which I'm going to get into soon. You also see the rise of what was called King Cotton, as with the demise of manufacturing in the United States, exports continued to rise, but it was more and more raw materials, namely slave produced cotton by the South, making the South much more dominant in American politics throughout this period. You can also see the value of imports. So from in the era of good feelings leading up to 1828, right about here, you can see the value of imports actually declined or remained fairly stable as the home market was encouraged and manufacturing proceeded at a good clip. There wasn't as much of a need for imports. With the decline of manufacturing, you then see after Andrew Jackson a huge rise in imports. So let's get into a little bit this treason faction, which starts to grow out of this period after the era of good feelings. So we have this grouping up in Boston, which are called Boston Brahmins. Sometimes they were called the Essex Junto because a lot of them were from Essex County. Family names like Lowell, Cabot, Higginson, and Coolidge, who were Anglophile banking syndicate families allied to England. Many of them were opium traders. They were many of the families who sponsored the Hartford Convention of the Federalist Party, um, advocating for the breakup of the United States. A lot of them, there was a grouping from this town, Newburyport in Massachusetts. You can see it on the map in relation to how far it is from Boston. One of the most famous was Caleb Cushing, who ran a number of so-called treason projects in this period before 1860. One of them called the South Carolina Project, which was to base this new, um, so to set up this new base of Anglophile, often tied to the Southern Rite of Freemasonry, the Scottish Rite of Freemasonry, excuse me, down in Charleston, South Carolina. And that was um, continuing the work of one of his mentors, Thomas Cooper. Some other people from Newburyport, William Lloyd Garrison, who's known as an abolitionist. So Caleb Cushing was very pro-slavery, and William Lloyd Garrison was very anti-slavery, but not in the way that Abraham Lincoln was against slavery. Lincoln's conception was that keeping the Union and the Constitution intact was crucial at all costs, even above ending slavery, Lincoln said in the beginning of his presidency, because the Union was the best instrument by which slavery could be ended legally and permanently in the United States. Whereas William Lloyd Garrison advocated for disunion, for the dissolution of the Constitution, because, as he called it, the slavery Constitution. So, and Caleb Cushing and nurtured the career of William Lloyd Garrison. They worked together at publishing newspaper in Newburyport where he nurtured his ideas. So it's interesting. This pro-slavery and this anti-slavery guy, they're very close, and they're both advocating for, the destruction of the Constitution and of the Union. Another person from Essex County, George Peabody, who was the forebearer of what became J.P. Morgan, and Albert Pike. Albert Pike was from Newburyport as well, and we'll see he becomes instrumental in the Scottish Rite of Freemasonry. Some other of the treason faction, I mentioned Thomas Cooper, who was before Caleb Cushing on the South Carolina project, with John A. Quitman, who was the leader in the South of the Scottish Rite of Freemasonry. So you had Caleb Cushing in the north, the northern Scottish Rite, and then Quitman in the south. You also had the families who were the stock owners of the Massachusetts Bank, which later became the First National Bank of Boston, funding a lot of, well, a lot of these treason projects, but also things like opium trading and, the ships on which the opium was brought in and the revenues were brought in. You also have Wall Street. So we have Aaron Burr and his Manhattan Company. Later on, we have August Belmont, who was the official Rothschild agent on Wall Street. Albert Pike, he's very famous for his Morals and Dogma of the ancient and accepted Scottish Rite of Freemasonry. Some offshoots of the Scottish Rite as well. The B'nai B'rith, which is a Jewish form of Freemasonry. The Knights of the Golden Circle in the 1850s, and the Young America movement, which we're going to get into. So you see this focus on these occult groups as a method of control by the oligarchy of setting up these various networks, something that Matt has done way more work on, and his work is spectacular on this. Both of these, the Knights of the Golden Circle and Young America, were financed by August Belmont. And Albert Pike, who I mentioned before from Newburyport, he's a protege of Caleb Cushing, and he becomes the leader of the Scottish Rite in 1858 once John A. Quitman dies. We have, right before Lincoln comes in, the presidency of James Buchanan, and is almost universally known as one of the worst presidents in U.S. history. He shifts a lot of U.S. federal military power down to the South, which can then be used to arm the coming insurrection. His Secretary of War, John Floyd, was a member of the Knights of the Golden Circle. Ulysses S. Grant said, Floyd, the Secretary of War, scattered the army so that much of it could be captured when hostilities should commence, and distributed the cannon and small arms from northern arsenals throughout the South so as to be on hand when treason wanted them. You also have P.G.T. Beauregard. He was also a member of the Knights of the Golden Circle. He was the man who initiated the firing on Fort Sumter, which kicked off the American Civil War. Clement Vallandigham was pretty much the head of the treason faction in the North during the Civil War. He was the leader of the Knights of the Golden Circle, which became renamed the Order of American Knights during the Civil War, but it was the same organization. He was also very good friends with Edwin Stanton before the war started. Edwin Stanton was Lincoln's Secretary of War, and it's interesting because there's questions about Edward Stanton's choices on the night that Lincoln was assassinated, that Stanton chose not to send any bodyguards to be at the theater who could have stopped John Wilkes Booth. So it's a little interesting factoid there. So at the start of the Civil War, the Knights of the Golden Circle had 65,000 members, which provided the Confederacy with both paramilitary forces and proto-governmental officials, and many of the roles in the Confederate government were members of the Knights of the Golden Circle in the 1850s. A little bit more charts and statistics. We can see here from the period of 1830 to the start of the Civil War, the amount of specie flowing out of the United States just increases year after year. We see foreign indebtedness pretty stable throughout the era of good feelings, and then dramatically improving around 1828, 1830, up until 1860.
Not improving, you mean increasing.
Sorry, did I say improving? Yeah, that's what I mean.
Yeah.
The indebtedness to foreign nations actually, declined slightly during the era of good feelings, and then increased rapidly during this period leading up to the Civil War. So then we get to 1860, the election of Abraham Lincoln, firing on Fort Sumter, and the commencement of the Civil War. Abraham Lincoln was steeped in this American system tradition his entire life. He said, during my whole political life, I have loved and revered him, meaning Henry Clay, as a teacher and a leader. He said, I was an old Henry Clay tariff Whig. In old times, I made more speeches on that subject than any other. I have not since changed my views. And even back in 1832, when he was first running for office, his introduction, he said, I am humble Abraham Lincoln. I've been solicited by many friends to become a candidate for the legislature. My politics are short and sweet, like the old woman's dance. I am in favor of a national bank. I'm in favor of the internal improvement system and a high protective tariff. So we see Lincoln his whole life, this consistency in this, he was deeply immersed in this American system tradition. I wrote an article years ago on this whole period, 1860 to 1865, analyzing the London Times reaction to Lincoln's protectionist policies. If anybody wants to read more about it, there it goes into great details, a ton of footnotes, um, which Matt graciously published on his Canadian Patriot. So we can see here in the very short sliver of time representing Abraham Lincoln's presidency, again, starting with the moral tariff, tariffs immediately start to increase. And in general, this whole period leading up to the death of William McKinley, we see very high tariff rates. We also see policies like the introduction of the greenback. Wall Street was attempting to take over control of the U.S. economy through the issuance, through control of the money of the nation, putting very unreasonable terms of loaning on Abraham Lincoln. And Lincoln instead turned around and said, okay, we're going to go with a paper currency, the greenback. He brought in as well the national banking system, which was a return to the Hamiltonian national banking system in order to oversee the greenbacks. He also created a new position called the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency to oversee the greenbacks. An office that still exists today, though it's with the Federal Reserve. It's much less important now. He also, even amidst Civil War, he pursued great projects, great internal improvements, such as beginning the Transcontinental Railroad. It was not completed by the time Lincoln was killed. It was completed 4 years after, but the impetus for it was Lincoln's administration. Here we see the two rail lines meeting up at Promontory Summit in Utah, which is right here, the Central Pacific and the Union Pacific. So as we know, John Wilkes Booth assassinates him, 1865. There's a lot that we could go into there in terms of John Wilkes Booth's networks, the British ties to the Confederate Secret Service, people like Judah Benjamin, who likely ran the assassination, but we won't get into it just in the interest of time. We see here so that Lincoln's funeral parade going back to his tomb in Springfield. There's many stops along the way. Here's a picture of one in Buffalo, New York. Just mobs of people everywhere paying their respects to their murdered president. And like Lincoln was going into 1865, like the war was wrapping up. He had achieved the 13th Amendment, like slavery was abolished. He just had such enormous political capital. The question of like what would have happened 1865 to 1869 if he hadn't been assassinated, like what what progress would the nation have made? Like we'll never know, but I mean it would have been nothing short of spectacular, I think. Immediately after or as Lincoln is dead, Wall Street and their allies start pushing for the immediate removal of the greenbacks and a return to the gold standard, which is controlled in the gold houses of London. So Simon Newcomb, who's related to the Boston Social Science Association, one of these Boston Brahmin outfits, writes a critical examination of our financial policy during the Southern Rebellion. He's advocating for a lowering of tariffs. He's advocating for contraction of the greenback supply and a return to a gold-backed dollar. You also have Lincoln's own Treasury Secretary, Hugh McCulloch, who later on, after his term, went to work for a bank in London, England. His report of 1865, which recommended the same thing, contraction of the greenback and reduction of tariffs and return to the gold standard. So Henry Carey and his networks they begin this flurry of activity to counter these moves, to protect the greenback and to keep Lincoln's system and to grow it. Between January 1866 and March 1869, when President Grant comes in, Henry Carey wrote over 1,000 pages attacking these networks that were trying to undo Lincoln's legacy. In 1869, Congress repeals McCulloch's Contraction Act, and that in the House was led by Thaddeus Stevens, who was a Pennsylvania ally of Henry Carey. In March, President Grant is inaugurated, and he pushes for greenback retirement and a return to gold for the payment of bondholders. And there was also, so Congress passes the Public Credit Act in March 1869 based on Grant's recommendation. You have a slight win of the Carey faction in April 1874, the inflation of currency bill with $400 million of new greenbacks issued. It passes the House and the Senate. There's massive freak out in New York and Boston, and they make this massive push on President Grant to veto the bill. It's led by John Murray Forbes in Boston and August Belmont in New York. The pressure on Grant leads him to veto the bill, and at that point, the Republican Party's in complete disarray. The Democrats win in 1874 in a massive landslide in the House. It was the first time they took the House in 20 years. And then in 1875, so we're going into another presidential convention in 1876. 1875 Democratic Convention, there's the Allen Carey tickets, not Henry Carey, it's somebody else named Carey. Their sole issue is the repeal of the Specie Resumption Act. So these are Democrats, not Republicans. They're saying the Specie Resumption Act, we need to repeal it because the Specie Resumption Act is supposed to take effect in 1879, which is a return to the gold standard. Boston, New York, again, completely freaked out. August Belmont, who was a lifelong Democrat, who was the head of the Democratic National Committee in the 1860s, starts funding a Republican, Rutherford B. Hayes, who is a gold guy. And Hayes wins, and the GOP is split into these two factions. And the Pennsylvania Industrial League, which previously was allied to Henry Carey, they break with Henry Carey and they endorse the gold standard. And from this point on, the Republican Party becomes the party of the gold standard, leading up to going into even William McKinley, 1896. So then 1879, Rutherford B. Hayes, the Specie Resumption Act comes in with John Sherman, another Anglophile, as Secretary of the Treasury. And now British and the Wall Street banking houses are in control of the U.S. currency. We start issuing new foreign bonds to be redeemed in gold, and these are sold through the houses of Rothschild and the House of Morgan, as well as the Morton Bliss and Company, and August Belmont, who was a Rothschild agent, the Seligman brothers, and Drexel Morgan. You had a number of panics, the Panic of 1884 and 1893. And we have in this period, I mean, I'm going to go back a little ways here before going forward again, but you have some new economic theories in the mid 1800s coming in. So we have somebody, who is this person I'm describing? He's a member of the board of directors of the Manchester Cotton Exchange. He is, his family is owners of textile mills, which were purchasers of cotton produced by American slaves. They sold those textiles in British India at the barrel of a gun, destroyed India's native textile industry, traded that in India for opium that was then sold to the Chinese. Fanatical free trader, absolutely vehemently against protectionism. He's one of these, fox hunting, upper crust people of Manchester. His family is from Germany's Wupper Valley, which was known as Little England. Very opposed to Friedrich List and what he was having an influence on in Germany. And he was a member of the Young Germany movement, which was a creation of Lord Palmerston in England. So who is this person that I'm describing? It's Friedrich Engels, the supporter, publisher of Karl Marx, of communism, and they were great enemies of Friedrich List and of Henry Carey In 1845, Friedrich Engels publishes Karl Marx a draft of an article on Friedrich List's book on the national system of political economy, very much Hamiltonian influenced. Marx is also published by the British agent David Urquhart, and much of Marx's life he actually lives in England. Slightly later on, in 1871, we see Karl Menger founds the Austrian School of Economics. Menger was a retainer of the House of Habsburg and Wittelsbach. He was also opposed to the Prussian industrialization policies, which were modeled on Hamilton and List. His ideological heritage in economics was John Stuart Mill and Jean-Baptiste Say, typical liberal free trade economics. He continued the mathematical political economy of the Bank of England's William Stanley Jevons, and he attacked Friedrich List as a communist, which is funny considering how the communists also attacked Friedrich List. What do these two have in common? So, I mean, this is like Austrian school right wing and communism, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. You would think, it could not be more opposite to each other, but their purpose was to create these new economic schools contrary to the American system, the national system of Friedrich List. Number one, they were both opposed to the nation state. Karl Marx very famously said in the Communist Manifesto that the state will wither away. The Austrian school, I mean, it's known the Austrian school is just very anti-nation state. They want as small of government as possible. Number two, they both were opposed to protectionism, both opposed to Friedrich List, and both were free traders. So some more of this treason faction that starts to grow within this period. J.P. Morgan's got to be top of the list. J.P. Morgan's father, mentored by George Peabody, I mentioned earlier, from Essex County, Massachusetts. He was the New York representative of his father's bank, which was a British bank. He ran slander against the nationalist financier Jay Cooke, who was selling Lincoln's bonds during the Civil War. That collapse of the Cooke House in 1873 caused a massive economic recession, depression in the Panic of 1873. This further weakened the nationalist faction in Philadelphia and strengthened this Morgan Rothschild with August Belmont control over the U.S. bond market and over the U.S. currency. By the 1900s, J.P. Morgan gains control of most of America's heavy industry. So it was no longer, some of these nationalist banking houses like Jay Cooke and a few others that we're going to see. And the economy was just dominated by J.P. Morgan. And during World War I, he was actually the official U.S. agent for the British Crown and Empire. John D. Rockefeller, everybody knows, he entered business with British money in 1859. His British partner, Maurice Clark, and he was allied with Cornelius Vanderbilt, another Anglophile Eastern establishment person, to build what became known as Standard Oil. He went to war with the Pennsylvania Railroad, which was allied to the nationalist circles in Pennsylvania of Henry Carey. Then the Great Strikes of 1877. Riots destroyed millions of dollars of Pennsylvania Railroad assets. But curiously, none of the Rockefeller assets or Vanderbilt assets were ever threatened during the Great Strikes in 1877. And the damage was too much. The Pennsylvania Railroad folded 2 months later. And later on, the Rockefeller Foundation becomes a very important U.S.-British nexus in American politics. We also have Jacob Schiff on Wall Street. His mentor was Sir Ernest Cassel, who was the personal banker of King Edward VII. At the request of the king, Schiff issued bonds in America to finance Japan's 1905 war against Russia. And that ruined the Russian-American alliance, which Henry Carey circles had been trying to build for the last 30 years. They also had on their board Sir William Wiseman, who was the head of British intelligence for North America in World War I. We have E.H. Harriman, who was an ally of August Belmont, an extreme Anglophile Eastern establishment person. In 1898, Sir Ernest Cassel again puts money from the crown through Kuhn Loeb to finance Harriman purchasing Union Pacific Railroad. So one of the major railroads in the United States falls under his control. As a side note, he was also a very enthusiastic supporter of eugenics, which is a common feature among these Anglophile networks at this time. And then his son, Averell Harriman, merges with Brown Brothers, which was an Anglo-American bank. It was the family banking house of Montague Norman family, Montague Norman of the Bank of England, to create Brown Brothers Harriman. Prescott Bush manages the bank. That's George Bush's father. He was represented legally by the Dulles brothers at Sullivan and Cromwell, the most important Wall Street legal firm. And through the Union Banking Corporation with Prescott Bush, he financed the rise of the Nazis and was prosecuted by FDR under the Trading with the Enemy Act. So this treason faction, it's it's important to understand, I think, for somebody like Trump, like who's shooting at him, who's he going up against, and without that understanding, I think you're very lost. So I think it's important to understand the growth and the origin of these networks. So Henry Carey and his allies in the 1870s, they lost the bank war. The return to the gold standard, the U.S. currency was now under control of London through their proxies on Wall Street. That was a big loss, but they weren't licked yet. They had another flank, which they tried to export the American system globally. So, starting in 1872, a key ally of Henry Carey, Erasmus Pashine Smith, goes to Japan to work with the Emperor Meiji during the Meiji Restoration on the industrialization of Japan, building new factories, coal, railroads, that sort of thing in Japan. They also, so during the 1876 Centennial Exposition, the organizing board of this was all allies of Henry Carey, and it was in Philadelphia, which is Henry Carey's hometown. Here we see a couple of prints from the time. The main exhibition building was 21.5 acres. At the time, it was the largest building in the world. Some other buildings, the horticultural building and machinery hall. So Henry Carey actually had a prominent booth inside Machinery Hall with all of his books and pamphlets, trying to educate people on the American system. And there was over 9 million visitors who attended from 37 countries. And the whole idea was Henry Carey was trying to educate them there and then export the American system around the world. And we'll see they did have success in several countries. This was his famous 1876 Commerce, Christianity, and Civilization versus British Free Trade, letters in reply to the London Times. That was one of his big pamphlets at the Centennial Exposition. So a few years after this, Germany is one country which breaks with the British free trade system under Otto von Bismarck. Count Sergei Witte in Russia said Otto von Bismarck kept a copy of Friedrich List's National System of Political Economy on his bedside table throughout his time in office. And here's some speeches that Otto von Bismarck made in the Reichstag, May 1879. So 3 years after the centennial, he says, our previous open door policies made us a dumping ground for the excess production of other countries. In my view, this drove prices in Germany through the floor. That prevented the growth of our industries and the development of our economic life. We must close this door and erect a higher barrier. And what I propose now is that we create the same market for German industry, which previously, out of the goodness of our hearts, we allowed foreigners to exploit. If the danger of protectionism were as great as the advocates of free trade claim, then France would long ago have become impoverished, since it has adhered to this theory since the times of Colbert. Three years later, May 1882, again in the Reichstag, he says, "The success of the United States in material development is the most illustrious of modern time. The American nation has not only successfully borne and suppressed the most gigantic and expensive war of all history, but immediately afterward disbanded its army, found employment for all its soldiers and marines, paid off most of its debt, given labor and homes to all the unemployed of Europe as fast as they could arrive within its territory, and still by a system of taxation so indirect as not to be perceived, much less felt." Talking about the system of protective tariffs. Um, this was before there was an income tax. "Because it's my deliberate judgment that the prosperity of America is mainly due to its system of protective laws, I urge that Germany has now reached that point where it is necessary to imitate the tariff system of the United States." And so relations between the US and Germany improve dramatically during this period. They become very close. Actually, 6 years later, in the House, William McKinley will actually quote this speech of Otto von Bismarck in defense of the protective system. Another key individual exporting the American system around the world was Horton Barker, a key financier and publisher of Henry Carey in Philadelphia. So he works with Count Sergei Witte, who was later Prime Minister Sergei Witte in Russia on the Trans-Siberian Railroad. Also worked with Dmitry Mendeleev on bringing industrial development, railroad, and mining to Russia. Here we see an ad in Russian for the Baldwin Locomotive Company, which was the largest, at the time, the largest locomotive company in the world. It was based in Philadelphia. And in many of these countries, like Japan and Russia, where American system advocates worked with the governments to develop rail systems, the Baldwin locomotive was the locomotive that was brought over to these countries. He also worked with Chinese circles to develop a rail system for China. The British and the Anglophile networks in New York and Boston were completely freaked out about this and put enormous pressure on China. And this was actually never built. These were the plans that Horton Barker developed with them, but they caved to the pressure from the British and never actually built this. If you look up who was who in America for the period covering 1887, it says Horton Barker obtained in 1887 valuable railroad, telegraph, and telephone concessions from China, withdrawn in 1888 by pressure upon the Chinese imperial government by the British government, maintained correspondence with leading Chinese, some of them leaders in the revolution resulting in the Republic, and regarded by them as an authority on Far Eastern affairs, advocate of American cooperation in the development of China's material resources. And we also have Sun Yat-sen, slightly later, who, again, as the founder of the Chinese Republic, he's very much inspired by Abraham Lincoln and the American system tradition. He lives in Hawaii, and he had what was called Jianguo Fanglue. I might be mispronouncing that, but it translates roughly to building of the nation. And that, unfortunately, as well, never got done. It's up to now Xi Jinping and the current Chinese government who are finally implementing these plans for the development of China. And we see during this period, so the economy just in this period before 1900 just takes off. Coal production rises 800%. Railway track mileage increases 567%. By the middle of the 1880s, the United States had surpassed Britain as the world's leading producer of manufactured goods and of steel. And yet, despite their growing wealth, Americans still steered clear of foreign entanglement. So it's key principle here, president of peace, Donald Trump wants to bring peace. It all ties in together. If you have these endless wars, if you have this military industrial complex, you can't have this. You don't have the capability to go and stretch yourself thin as an imperial force and also have this, you know, pro-development American system ideal of developing the nation. You can't do both. So 1880s, we see President James Garfield comes in. This is an interesting story. So in 1880, Horton Barker, he backs Garfield for the presidency. Garfield initially was not going to run for the presidency, but Horton Barker maneuvered at the convention and eventually got Garfield nominated. Now, Roscoe Conkling, who's part of this New York machine of Morgan and Belmont, and James Blaine, they were bitter enemies. And something called the National Republican League in Philadelphia was organized by allies of Henry Carey. This becomes the backbone of Garfield's campaign. And July 1880, Horton Barker writes to the Russian Foreign Ministry on the common work of Russia and America, namely the dismemberment of the British Empire. So 1881, Garfield is elected president. James Blaine is Secretary of State. Conkling wants Levi P. Morton of Morton and Bliss, who's part of this gold bond syndicate on Wall Street, to be named Secretary of Treasury. Garfield says, no Wall Street banker at Treasury. Garfield wanted to return to the Jay Cook style bond sales, which were sales directly to the people, returning to this Lincoln tradition of financing. He also brings in Robert Lincoln, Abraham Lincoln's son, as Secretary of War. 1881, March 10th, Horton Barker is informed that Tsar Alexander II has agreed to his plan for the development of southern Russia. 3 days later, the Tsar is assassinated. September, Garfield is assassinated. And Chester A. Arthur of Conkling's New York machine becomes president. Garfield's assassin, Charles Guiteau, screams out when he kills Garfield that I am a stalwart. The stalwart was the Conkling faction in the Republican Party. He was this brainwashed cult member from Oneida, New York, which Matt actually writes about in great deal in his new book. I didn't know a lot of details about this before, but it was this like sex cult, brainwashing cult. It's really interesting, the section in Matt's third volume of his latest series. If you want to learn more about the cult up in Oneida, New York, which for some reason eventually becomes Oneida Silverware, which is still like around. It's one of the biggest silverware companies in the world. I'm not sure exactly how that happened. And Horton Barker in 1916 wrote The Secret History of the Garfield nomination, saying that when Garfield was killed, he had begun a war on Wall Street. And pretty soon we're going to see this repeated. I mean, we're going to see this repeated several times in American history where this poor choice for vice president gets elevated to the presidency, completely the antithesis of the American system president that's assassinated. It's always American system presidents that are assassinated. Like I said, not necessarily pro-tariff. We'll see some later that aren't pro-tariff, but they're always of this pro-industrial development mindset. A few other dates. 1876, Emil Rathenau from Germany visits Philadelphia, the Centennial Exposition. We don't know for sure if he met Carey or Thomas Edison, but he becomes Thomas Edison's German partner 3 years later. And then 4 years after that, he sets up the first electric power station in Russia in St. Petersburg. Thomas Edison, by the way, his whole career was sponsored by this Philadelphia nationalist faction, eventually moving him to Menlo Park in New Jersey. But that was several years after they had already sponsored and nurtured his inventive career. So this I found useful in terms of, Trump now he's saying, tariff on everything. We're going to tariff everything. That's what used to be called the democratic revenue tariff, not a protective tariff. So McKinley in 1888, in speeches in the House on the Mills tariff, he gives this speech where he goes through what is a revenue tariff, what is a productive tariff. So he says, what is a revenue tariff? A revenue tariff, what principle does it rest? It's a tariff or tax placed upon such articles of foreign production imported here as will produce the largest revenue with the smallest tax. Or, as Robert J. Walker, late Secretary of the Treasury and author of the Tariff of 1846, from whom the advocates of the measure draw their inspiration, put it, the only true maxim is that which experience demonstrates will bring in each case the largest revenue at the lowest rate of duty, and that no duty be imposed upon any article above the lowest rate, which will yield the largest amount of revenue. The revenue, said Mr. Walker, from ad valorem duties last year, 1845, exceeded that realized from specific duties, although the average of the ad valorem duties was only 23.57%, and the average of the specific duties 41.3%, presenting another strong proof that the lower duties increase the revenue. To secure larger revenue from lower duties necessitates largely increased importations, and if these compete with domestic products, the latter must be diminished, or find other and distant, and I may say impossible markets, or get out of the way altogether. A genuine revenue tariff imposes no tax upon foreign importations, the like of which are produced at home, or if produced at home, in quantities not capable of supplying the home consumption, in which case it may be truthfully said the tax is added to the foreign cost and paid by the consumer. A revenue tariff seeks out those articles which domestic production cannot supply, or only inadequately supply, and which the wants of our people demand, and imposes the duty on them, and permits as far as possible the competing foreign product to be imported free of duty. This principle is made conspicuous in the bill under consideration. For example, wool, a competing foreign product, which our own flock masters can fully supply for domestic wants, is put upon the free list, while sugar, with a home product of only 1/11 of the home consumption, is left dutiable. So, wool, which we can fully supply ourselves, is not on this revenue tariff, but sugar, which we can't supply for ourselves, is taxed with a tariff. Any tax levied upon a foreign product, which is a necessity to our people and which we cannot fully supply, will produce revenue in amount only measured by our necessities and ability to buy. In a word, foreign productions not competing with home productions are the proper subjects for taxation under a revenue tariff, and in case these do not furnish the requisite revenue, a low duty is put upon the foreign product competing with the domestic one, low enough to encourage and stimulate importations, and low enough to break down eventually domestic competition. For example, the duty proposed under this bill upon cotton bagging will extinguish the industry here, and under its provisions would import all of that product from Calcutta and Dundee. A large revenue would come from this source because the foreign would take the place of the domestic production. This duty is a revenue one and gives no protection whatsoever to the home producer. If it did, it would not be a revenue tariff. As the Cobden School is the British free trade school of political science puts it, the moment it is made clear that a tax is a benefit to home producers, then the free trade dogma condemns it. The test is simple and easy of application. Free trade or a revenue tariff does not allow any import duties being imposed on such articles as are likewise produced at home. Or if produced at home, a revenue tariff would soon destroy their production. So, in comparison, what is a protective tariff? It's a tariff upon foreign imports so adjusted as to secure the necessary revenue and judiciously imposed upon those foreign products, the like of which are produced at home or the like of which we are capable of producing at home. It imposes the duty upon the competing foreign product. It makes it bear the burden or duty, and as far as possible, luxuries only excepted, permits the non-competing foreign product to come in free of duty. Articles of common use, comfort, and necessity, which we cannot produce here, it sends to the people untaxed and free from custom house exactions. Tea, coffee, spices, and drugs are such articles and under our system are upon the free list. It says to our foreign competitor, if you want to bring your merchandise here, your farm products here, your coal and iron ore, your wool, your salt, your pottery, your glass, your cottons and woolens, and sell alongside our producers in our markets, we will make your product bear a duty. In effect, pay for the privilege of doing it. Our kind of a tariff makes the competing foreign article carry the burden, draw the load, supply the revenue. And in performing this essential office, it encourages at the same time our own industries and protects our own people in their choice of employments. That is the mission and purpose of a protective tariff. Free trade in the United States is founded upon a community of equalities and reciprocities. It is like the unrestrained freedom and reciprocal relations and obligations of a family. Here we are one country, one language, one allegiance, one standard of citizenship, one flag, one constitution, one nation, one destiny. It is otherwise with foreign nations, each a separate organism, a distinct and independent political society organized for its own, to protect its own, and work out its own destiny. We deny to those foreign nations free trade with us upon equal terms with our own producers. The foreign producer has no right or claim to equality with our own. He is not amenable to our laws. There are resting upon him none of the obligations of citizenship. He pays no taxes. He performs no civil duties. He is subject to no demands for military service. He is exempt from state, county, and municipal obligations. He contributes nothing to the support, the progress, and glory of the nation. Why should he enjoy unrestrained, equal privileges and profits in our markets with our producers, our labor, and our taxpayers? Another quote from McKinley, which I really like. Under free trade, the trader is the master and the producer the slave. Protection is but the law of nature, the law of self-preservation, of self-development, of securing the highest and best destiny of the race of man. It is said that protection is immoral. Why, if protection builds up and elevates 63 millions of people, the influence of those 63 million of people elevates the rest of the world. We cannot take a step in the pathway of progress without benefiting mankind everywhere. Well, they say, buy where you can buy the cheapest. Of course, that applies to labor as to everything else. Let me give you a maxim that is 1,000 times better than that, and it is the protection maxim. Buy where you can pay the easiest. And that spot of earth is where labor wins its highest rewards. So this is a key feature of the American protective system, that it was encouraging a very high wage economy. Trading in raw materials, typically, you're trading at very low prices. You're able to gain much higher prices for value added, and that value added typically comes from taking the raw materials and making something out of it, which is difficult for people to do without making that big investment in industry. And so, as a consequence, from the time of Alexander Hamilton, it was recognized that the encouragement of this economic system encouraged a very high wage economy. And so he's saying, okay, maybe the products are not as cheap because we have the protective tariff, but people are making a lot more money. And so they're able to pay the easiest. That spot of earth is where labor wins its highest rewards. So we see this continuation. McKinley is really, the ultimate continuation of the Lincoln legacy in this period. We go from Lincoln to Henry Carey to McKinley. And now, with everything Trump is saying in favor of McKinley, can Trump be the continuation of the McKinley legacy and thus of the Lincoln, the Henry Clay, John Quincy Adams, and Alexander Hamilton legacy? And that's going to depend a lot on his understanding of the protective tariff versus the revenue tariff. And I mean, this sounds a lot like Trump's words as well. Peace is the national desire and the goal of every American aspiration. That's William McKinley. But, Trump is echoing the exact same sentiments. So in 1890, this is really a tremendous period of growth in the United States. You have the McKinley tariff coming in, but in Germany, you have the ouster of Otto von Bismarck, who, so Kaiser Wilhelm II, who was not very wise man, let's just put it that way. He was deluded into thinking that Otto von Bismarck was bad for his nation, and he asked for him, he asked for him to resign, or he got rid of him. And so Bismarck was making these alliances. So he was making alliances with Austria, he was making alliances with Russia, and Bismarck's whole idea behind this is going to ensure that we don't go to war, that we are increasingly partners in peace and economic development. And this gets completely undone. And this is really one of the key factors to World War I, actually, is when Bismarck is ousted in Germany. So in 1890 in the US, we have the McKinley tariff brought in. McKinley's in the House. It's the highest in US history. It also brings in, it's interesting, this principle of reciprocity, which is that they negotiate with foreign countries and they say, look, we're going to put these tariffs on you, but if we can negotiate and you can lower your tariffs on us, we will in turn lower our tariffs on you, which is a new development in the tariff aspect of the American system. The Democrats, they take control in 1890, and then in 1892, Grover Cleveland, and then you have the Panic of 1893. And because of that, the U.S. government is forced to take out a new gold loan again to stave off economic collapse, again from gold loans negotiated with the houses of Morgan and Belmont on Wall Street. You also have the Wilson-Gorman tariff reductions in 1894. William McKinley publishes in 1896 this book, The Tariff in the Days of Henry Clay and Since, an exhaustive review of our tariff legislation from 1812 to 1896. This is a very useful history if ever you want to read it. It's available online. So McKinley becomes president. There's a severe economic downturn. People are clamoring for change, and he's elected president. Um, and we have this Boston Brahmin figure, Thomas Jefferson Coolidge. Senator Henry Cabot Lodge pushes for McKinley to make Thomas Jefferson Coolidge Secretary of the Treasury, and McKinley says no. Coolidge's father was Joseph Coolidge. He was this classic Boston Brahmin, opium trading Anglophile. And so then Senator Lodge then recommends Teddy Roosevelt to McKinley for the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, and McKinley says yes. And Teddy Roosevelt then maneuvers Navy ship movements down south in the Caribbean, which precipitated the Spanish-American War. So McKinley often gets blamed for the Spanish-American War, and it's said McKinley's this imperialist. But if you look deeper into it, it's actually Teddy Roosevelt who maneuvers this into happening. And Teddy Roosevelt, he's from New York. He's part of this same New York political machine. That's key to understand. This was a speech I found. I'm not sure what this is. It just says U of M. I don't know which one it is, but that McKinley delivered, which has some great little snippets in it. So it says the same fundamental differences which divide them. The great ideas came with the creation of the federal government by the Convention of 1787. One was the national idea, the other was the states' rights idea, and from then until now they have been fundamental in the creeds of the two great parties. The old leaders are their idols still, and from them they draw inspiration. Jefferson and Calhoun, Jackson and Tilden are the names most beloved and cherished by Democrats everywhere. Hamilton and Webster, Clay and Lincoln still inspire the highest and best sentiments of the Republican Party and are the silent but powerful leaders of Republican thought today. I need not say to you what the world knows, that this country, after nearly 1/3 of a century of protection, has reached the proud position of being the first in manufacturers, first in mining, and first in agriculture, and in invention and in educational advantages for the masses of all the nations of the world, that labor is better rewarded, that skill and genius command higher returns, and the great body of the people have wider and better opportunities for advancement than can be found anywhere in the wide, wide world. Protection builds up, a revenue tariff tears down. Protection brings hope and courage to heart and home. Free trade drives them from both. Free trade levels down, protection levels up. We are getting on better than we ever got on during the revenue tariff periods of our history. We are getting on better than any of our sister nations. We have made matchless progress in the 31 years of protection, and no single year has been more satisfactory than the one just passed. Are we to abandon the policy under which we have advanced to the first rank in development and prosperity? I bid my countrymen pause and ponder before taking the fatal step. Why should we? Let the theorists and doctrinaires answer. What do they offer in exchange? What assurance do they give us of the future well-being of our country under their system? Experience, which is ordinarily the best teacher, they discard altogether. For that experience in the history of our own country is a conclusive condemnation of their principles and policy when carried into actual administration. England is the only free trade country in the world. Is there anything in her progress and civilization, great as they are, in the condition of her masses, in her opportunities and possibilities, to invite us to turn away from our ancient policy? No American citizen would exchange what we have and enjoy for what England offers. Does this revenue tariff policy offer more work and better wages, more opportunities for labor and skill and effort? So here we see the brief period 1896 to 1900, 1901. You see under McKinley tariffs rising sharply. And then 1901, McKinley's assassinated. Teddy Roosevelt comes in, and we see leading up to the 20s Um, just a near constant decline in the tariffs. This was also a period of great optimism. This is an image from the 1890 work by William Gilpin on the Cosmopolitan Railway. Um, Matt has done a lot of great work on this, which I would encourage you to go look at if you'd like to learn more about it. But he's advocating for a connection between America and Russia across the Bering Strait by rail. And why rail? I mean, it's crucial to understand why were they always emphasizing these land corridors, these new transportation corridors across land? Well, the reason was that the British Empire was a maritime based power. They controlled all of these choke points all around the world that were naval choke points. So by developing these new trade routes on land that were based on rail and road, you were flanking the British Empire. That the British Empire had no power over these trade routes, and you were severely diminishing their ability to exercise power globally. This was the Intercontinental Railway, which McKinley was working towards before he got assassinated, that would have connected all of North and South America by rail. The Pan American Conference, this was first attempted by James Blaine under President Garfield in 1881, but then when Garfield was killed, Blaine had to delay it until 1889 with President Harrison. And the first Pan American Conference took place 1889 in Washington, D.C. Then Blaine dies in 1892. He gives McKinley its 8-volume report. It had 311 maps in it. A commission was formed to develop plans to execute this. The chairman of the commission was Alexander Cassatt, who was a Henry Carey ally. He was an ally of these nationalist industrialist circles in Pennsylvania. He himself was a Pennsylvania railroad executive. And McKinley actually was at the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, New York in 1901, where he was shot. And that this is one of the things he was discussing with other leaders in the hemisphere. So here's McKinley being shot by Leon Sogols. He has like a Slavic name. I'm not exactly sure how to pronounce it. And brings in Teddy Roosevelt. So McKinley was put under great pressure by the New York machine to bring in Teddy Roosevelt as his vice president in the 1900 election. So he was not his vice president in 1896. And this is something that we see again and again, from Lincoln bringing in Andrew Johnson to Garfield bringing in Chester A. Arthur to JFK and even FDR, who wasn't killed, but Harry Truman was never his vice president up until 1944. And if Henry Wallace had been his vice president when FDR died, the world would have been much, much different. So Teddy Roosevelt's a huge fan of Alfred Thayer Mahan, who wrote this, The Influence of Sea Power Upon History. And so Teddy Roosevelt, he's very big on promoting naval development, similar to maritime control of the British Empire, and not so much these land corridors. So he cancels the plans for the Pan American rail development and instead pushes the immediate progress of the Panama Canal, what became the Panama Canal. So as a way of strengthening the naval power of the country. And so to this day, there's this part called the Darien Gap. So the entire continent is now linked up by road, except for the Darien Gap. It's still, to this day, is not connected. So there still is no one cohesive land bridge between North America and South America. And we're told it's just impossible. You just can't develop the Darien Gap. And I would love to see, you know, Trump talks about better relations with China. Um, I would love to see a joint U.S. China collaboration on fulfilling this mission and proving all of these naysayers wrong that indeed we can. I mean, we have such advanced technology nowadays. There are definitely challenges to working in the Darien Gap, but that we can't overcome them at all is, I think, just nonsense. So you start to see under Teddy Roosevelt as well this going abroad in search of monsters to destroy, completely antithetical to the American legacy. And it's very much the precursor to what later becomes like CIA operations in Guatemala to overthrow Arbenz. So you have this United Fruit Company, which is a merger of Boston Brahmin banking and New Orleans mafia. So Thomas Jefferson Coolidge of Boston founds United Fruit along with Joe Macheca and Charles Matrenga, two mafia guys of New Orleans. In 1943, Charles Matrenga dies, and the entire board of United Fruit attends the funeral of this mafioso. And so the United Fruit is very similar, not so much to like a standard corporation, but it's more like the British East India Company. In South America, it's known as El Pulpo, the octopus. It just has its tentacles everywhere. They have their own navy called the Great White Fleet. It's a private navy. Interestingly, during the Bay of Pigs, the CIA used United Fruit's Great White Fleet to during the assault during the Bay of Pigs. They also they set up their own forms of government on these fruit plantations, primarily bananas at the time. So, like for example, the workers don't get paid in currency. They don't get paid in American dollars. They don't get paid in, the Spanish real or whatever it is. They get paid in these vouchers by the United Fruit Company, and then the United Fruit Company has these stores where the vouchers can be redeemed for goods. So they have their own currency. And so Roosevelt comes in with what's known as the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, which was not a corollary, it was a complete undoing of the Monroe Doctrine. And really, TR is like the precursor of all, like I said, all of these CIA interventions. So often, for the benefit of United Fruit, TR would send down the Marines to take out some, foreign agitator who's trying to work for better conditions or for independence from United Fruit in defense of the corporate interests back in America. And here's another cartoon of Teddy Roosevelt taking his big stick diplomacy all over the Caribbean. So one of his famous phrases was speak softly and carry a big stick. Teddy Roosevelt, one of the major influences on his life was his uncle, James Dunwoody Bullock. Actually, he had two Bullock uncles who were both Confederates. So the other uncle served on the CSS Alabama for the Confederacy, but James Dunwoody Bullock was the head of Confederate intelligence in England. And after the war, Teddy Roosevelt actually traveled to England to see his uncle, and his uncle was one of his favorite people in the whole world. He actually procured diplomatic recognition for the Confederacy to the extent possible in England, and also arms and munitions and ships, the CSS Alabama. The building that James Dunwoody Bullock worked out of is still standing in Liverpool. This is it here, and you can see it has the Union Jack and the American flag, and it has two doors. One marked the Alabama House, and the other one marked the Bullock House for James Dunwoody Bullock. This is funny. This is really short, but Johnny Harris, he's like this kind of milquetoast liberal, quote unquote reporter. I think he used to be with Vox, and now he's independent. But I call this Johnny Harris discovers Teddy Roosevelt. It's very short.
Time. Oh God, I can't get away from this guy, Teddy Roosevelt. Once again, I swear, I get into any story, I like start to research it, and it's like, yeah, and then there's American imperialism, and it's like Teddy Roosevelt like shows up. Anyway, so Teddy Roosevelt.
So and that's actually a video that he made about the United Fruit Company.
Time.
Another thing was Teddy Roosevelt was this extreme Anglophile, and he had this extensive correspondence with King Edward VII, where they were, shall we say, largely in agreement about many things. Teddy Roosevelt said, "The real interests of the English-speaking peoples are one, alike in the Atlantic and the Pacific." And Teddy Roosevelt is famous. He believed in race science. You know, he believed that the white race was superior to the inferior yellow and brown races, and all sorts of disgusting eugenics beliefs as well. King Edward VII, during this period, he rams through this triple entente with the ouster of Otto von Bismarck. This is the British chance to regain some of the lost foothold that they were losing to the spread of the American system around the world. So it was this alliance of England, France, and Russia against Germany. And what we'll see in World War I is that all of these countries, France, Germany, Russia, Japan, China, all of these countries that the American system had started spreading to, were all the countries that were targeted during World War I. Some other British moves at this time, Halford Mackinder and Milner's Kindergarten, the Round Table groups, the Rhodes Scholarship. These were all attempts to redefine the British Empire and regain control over their quote-unquote lost colony, the United States. Under Teddy Roosevelt, he had Secretary of State Elihu Root, who we're going to encounter a bit later. Some other things that happened under Teddy Roosevelt. In 1908, he sets up the Bureau of Investigation, which is the precursor to the FBI, something that, you know, Trump is very familiar with, the FBI. And in 1907, after the panic of 1907, Teddy Roosevelt sets up the National Monetary Commission with J.P. Morgan, which leads to the creation of the Federal Reserve. And so here's a clip from today. Jerome Powell, he says he would not resign as the Fed chief if Trump asked for his resignation because the president does not have the legal power to fire or demote him. So they claim they are this independent fourth branch of government, which is just blatantly unconstitutional. The Federal Reserve is ostensibly owned by the U.S. government, but actually the stock of the 12 district Federal Reserve banks are privately owned by the Wall Street banks. Some of the key people who set up the Federal Reserve are this part of this treason faction we've been seeing. You have Henry Davison from J.P. Morgan, Benjamin Strong, also J.P. Morgan, Paul Warburg and Jacob Schiff, Kuhn Loeb, we saw earlier, Frank Vanderlip from Rockefeller National City Bank, and Senator Nelson Aldrich, who is the father-in-law of John D. Rockefeller II. So we have in 1910 the Jekyll Island meeting, where these guys all got together. I believe it's in Georgia on Jekyll Island. They traveled all in secret because if anybody found out that they were there, the whole plan would be blown. Because everybody knew like they weren't working in the public interest. They were working on something that would benefit them at the expense of the nation. And then after the Jekyll Island meeting, they found the National Citizens League for the Promotion of a Sound Banking System. Sounds really great and healthy. 1910 to 1912, Aldrich tries numerous times to introduce Federal Reserve legislation, but it keeps on being rejected. It's like it's too obvious that it's this coup, this like bankers dictatorship that they're trying to set up, and it keeps getting rejected. So they realize it can't be a Republican. It's Taft who's in power right now. It needs to be a Democrat in power in order to get this signed. So 1912, George Perkins, who's a senior partner at JP Morgan, runs the Bull Moose campaign for Teddy Roosevelt against Taft. So that splits the Republican vote, which gets Woodrow Wilson into office. He had less than 42% of the vote. Then after that, you have these Pujo hearings, which are kind of like the show trial of Wall Street that it doesn't actually reveal that much about Wall Street shenanigans, but it's there to create in the press this anti-Wall Street sentiment, which then Carter Glass, of whom Glass-Steagall is named after, introduces essentially the same Aldrich plan, but now it's marketed as, oh, with all this anti-Wall Street sentiment, we're going to introduce this. This is going to counter this big bad Wall Street that we've exposed through the Pujo hearings. There were some, like Senator Lindbergh, who sees through it, and he vocally denounces the bill, but it still passes December 22nd, 1913, and President Wilson signs it into law the next day, December 23rd. So under Wilson, we have Secretary of State Robert Lansing, who is the uncle of Allen Dulles and John Foster Dulles, and Wilson's closest advisor, Colonel House, who isn't actually a colonel. He was never in the military. It's just this made-up title for him. His father was British. He was educated in England. He vehemently hates the American system of the constitutional republic. He's rabidly Anglophile. He's also extremely racist. He's pro-segregation. Like Colonel House was a real piece of work. And then following World War I, Colonel House sets up what's known as the Inquiry, which is attempting to strengthen Wilson's post-war plan, because quote unquote Wilsonian democracy after World War One. I don't know if I just said World War Two, but World War One. The plan that Wilson and his advisors like House had come up with for the post-war world, which included the League of Nations and a lot of things that these Anglophile networks really loved, they weren't very popular, and legislatively they weren't doing very well. And so Colonel House sets up this. It's called the Inquiry with a bunch of fellow Anglophiles to try and mold public opinion. And this inquiry becomes what's now known as the Council on Foreign Relations in America, with its sister organization, Chatham House, the Royal Institute of International Affairs, which comes out of these roundtable groups in the British Empire. And some of the key early Council on Foreign Relations members are Archibald Carey Coolidge, who's the nephew of Thomas Jefferson Coolidge that we saw earlier, Elihu Root, who we saw earlier, Secretary of State under Teddy Roosevelt, Allen Dulles as well, second director of the Council on Foreign Relations, and Walter Lippmann, this like proto-technocrat, very anti-democracy, wants like this educated intelligence elite to run the country. He thinks democracy is too messy, and the vast majority of people don't really know anything anyway, so democracy is useless. Walter Lippmann is the mentor of Edward Bernays, who writes On Propaganda, which is the modern manual of the public relations industry, basically how to spin and lie to the public in order to convince them of what you're trying to get them to believe. Another key early Council on Foreign Relations member, John W. Davis. So he was Woodrow Wilson's ambassador to the United Kingdom. He was J.P. Morgan's lawyer. He's pro segregation. He's against women's suffrage. He's later against the New Deal. He joins the American Liberty League with J.P. Morgan. He's implicated in that business plot to overthrow the government and bring in a military dictatorship. So that brings us nicely to FDR. I mean, we know, the story of the 20s. You see this massive increase in speculation on Wall Street, the roaring 20s, and the decline of industry and manufacturing leading to this collapse in 29. And 3 years of hardship, which brings FDR in 1932. And FDR, though he was a Democrat, there's a lot of evidence that he was aware of this American system tradition. So in his Harvard thesis in 1901, he wrote, George Washington, the first president under the Constitution, made Hamilton Secretary of the Treasury, the greatest of the cabinet offices. As he had stabilized the problems of state, so now he ordered the finances of the country, and it was his impetus that removed for all time the risk of disintegration of the states. None appreciated this solidarity more than Aaron Burr, who defeated for the presidency in his race against Jefferson, largely through the efforts of Hamilton, saw in this greater financial security the banishment of his dream of establishing a Northern Confederacy. So he's showing appreciation for Hamilton here. He's aware of the dynamics of the trader class of Aaron Burr on Wall Street, trying to break up the country with Burr's plans for a Northern Confederacy. And then this was interesting. In 29, he had a correspondence with fellow Democrats. He said, I think it's time for us Democrats to claim Lincoln as one of our own. The Republican Party has certainly repudiated first and last everything that he stood for. So FDR forms this coalition of labor and industrialists, including Democrats and Republicans, like Lincoln Republicans, and wins this massive victory, bringing in his New Deal in 33, which brings a number of enemies from this same treason faction. J.P. Morgan. Inside his own administration, you have his budget director, Lewis Douglas, actively working against the New Deal, trying to bring in a balanced budget and reduce spending. James Warburg, Wall Street, Dean Acheson, sort of one of the anti-New Deal Democrats we see later giving advice to JFK, Grenville Clark, and his law partners, Elihu Root and Henry Stimson, Willard Straight from J.P. Morgan, who was the founder of Walter Lippmann's New Republic magazine, and Wall Street lawyer Paul Cravath, Bernard Baruch, and John J. McCloy, who we later see involved in things like the Warren Commission and the World Bank. So we know all about the business plot that these traders tried to bring in. It was stopped by the actions of Smedley Butler, who was a Marine who spent years as what he called a gangster for capitalism, going down to all these South American countries under people like Teddy Roosevelt. And he had just had enough of it. And he said, I'm not going to do this to my country. So he went public with the information and revealed the plans. And FDR gained tremendous leverage for a time over this faction based on the findings of the Senate committee that Smedley Butler brought his revelations to. A lot of people don't know this, but under FDR, Jesse Jones headed the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, which became the largest lender of credit to the U.S. government, to the U.S. economy, I should say. So even more than the Federal Reserve. So FDR, to my knowledge, is the only president who was able to rout the Federal Reserve and create a separate entity, which becomes even more important for issuing productive credit into the economy than the Federal Reserve. And we know, FDR and later JFK, they're Democrats, so they're not as big on tariffs. There still were some tariffs under FDR, much less so under JFK. But what they were for was this Hamiltonian notion of investment in great projects that are internal improvements that elevate the platform on which the entire economy operates. Such as, for example, under FDR, we had the Tennessee Valley Authority. Roosevelt, he dies, and again, bad vice president who's brought in. Harry Truman comes in, sets up Central Intelligence Agency, eventually, not at first, but eventually led for many years by Allen Dulles. Also, National Security Act of 1947, a number of things. We'll skip over Eisenhower. We'll go to, so JFK, he is very consciously returning to the FDR tradition. He's trying to. He even visits Eleanor Roosevelt on the campaign to discuss with her in, I can't remember if it was 59 or 60. But he's very consciously a return to the FDR tradition in the Democratic Party. Of course, he wins, becomes president in 61. A number of advanced projects that he's working on, such as the nuclear rocket. Here he is visiting the nuclear rocket development station in 1962. Once he's killed, the program is killed. Even though it was called the Nerva rocket, it worked. It was never actually brought into production, ever used, but it did. It passed all of its testing. He was also working with Senator Frank Moss, on the development of what was called NWAPA, the North American Water and Power Alliance. Again, a great infrastructure project to bring water, irrigation for agriculture, and electrical power to the entire southwest of the United States, which really desperately needed it and still needs it. I mean, we see these fires in California and the empty reservoirs. And, keeping on this peace theme from McKinley to Trump, JFK's famous peace speech, where he says, "The United States, as the world knows, will never start a war. We do not want a war. We do not now expect a war. This generation of Americans has already had enough, more than enough, of war and hate and oppression. We shall be prepared if others wish it. We shall be alert to try and stop it. But we shall also do our part to build a world of peace, where the weak are safe and the strong are just. We are not helpless before that task or hopeless of its success. Confident and unafraid, we labor on, not toward a strategy of annihilation, but toward a strategy of peace." And I think of, the outgoing Biden administration and how close we are to war with Russia, and hopefully, getting rid of this strategy of annihilation, and with Trump going back towards a strategy of peace. Of course, we know November 22nd, 1963, JFK is assassinated. I won't go into it too much. I mean, I don't know very many people at this point who still believe the official story of it. I think it was one of the big events that helped wake people up to the reality of this treason faction, which now is sometimes called the deep state. But we have, again, a terrible vice president, Johnson, just like Lincoln, actually. Vice President Johnson comes in and immediately turns around JFK's entire policy, dramatically escalates the Vietnam War, with the phony Gulf of Tonkin incident, which never actually happened. And so you have this path that the U.S. is on of peace and development completely subverted. And again, you see just, a hopeless destroyed population instead, with just this bleak reality of this pointless Vietnam War. You then have other assassinations as well, which further damages this whole baby boomer um, generation, with Martin Luther King and then Bobby Kennedy, which they keep putting their hopes in these leaders, and these leaders just keep getting assassinated. It really psychologically breaks this generation, and starting in the 70s, just turns them into the me generation of, I'm not going to get involved. There is no hope. We can't do anything. They're too powerful. I'm just going to take care of myself. And then so this increased military spending in Vietnam leads to the Nixon shock in 71, where he takes the nation off of the Bretton Woods system, which is the beginning of the end for the productive economy. From there, we have the deindustrialization, the controlled disintegration of the U.S. economy, as the Council on Foreign Relations put it, and the era of globalization, free trade dominating that I've known basically my entire life. Here we see the signing of NAFTA as one example in 1992. We've seen a massive exacerbation of income inequality since the 1970s. We've seen the development, the deindustrialization of the United States, leading to what's known as the Rust Belt, which was a huge contributor to Trump winning in 2016. All of these states had hope in Obama, and Obama, just as a classic neoliberal, continuing this free trade globalization policy, did absolutely nothing for them. And here you can see the end of the Bretton Woods system, and the U.S. merchandise trade balance just goes into the negative ever since. The productive economy declining, the U.S. share, the manufacturing share of total jobs declining year after year. Productivity increases, but after 1971, income no longer tracks with it. Before that, it tracked very nicely. You also see beginning in 1980, complete collapse of American net exports, as America moved away from a productive economy to the quote unquote services economy, consumer economy, whatever you want to call it. We've seen debt skyrocket in the United States. Both public and private debt. We've seen a massive expansion of the U.S. military all throughout the world. So as opposed to John Quincy Adams, America now goes abroad in search of monsters to destroy constantly. Recently, we've seen, the rise of the World Economic Forum and this conglomerate of oligarchs. We even have now the King of England himself giving his speech in 2020, pushing the Great Reset at the World Economic Forum. And so now we come to the present, and so Trump, this is an opportunity, I think, that Trump is probably going to be the most anti-British president we've had in a long time, largely because Keir Starmer gave so much support to Kamala Harris trying to beat Trump. And I see that as an opportunity. Here we see Trump. This was in his first term, actually, in 2017. And listen to what he says here.
And the great 19th century American statesman, Henry Clay, represented Kentucky in the United States Congress. Henry Clay believed in what he called the American system and proposed tariffs to protect American industry and finance American infrastructure.
So Trump is very much aware of this American system history. So, the question is, with Trump threatening tariffs and everything, what sort of tariffs are we going to get? Are we going to get a new revenue tariff 2.0, just tariff everything? I don't see that as a positive. I think that if not applied correctly, tariffs can actually be very damaging and will only help in the long term the free traders. It will only bolster their arguments. So where do we go from here? What would I like to see? I would like to see Trump's talking about global cooperation. I'd like to see as much of that as possible. Collaboration with the BRICS nations. Focus on economic development for peace. Countries that more and more are working together and developing together are less likely to go to war with each other. I'd like to see him encourage the national sovereignty of the nation through the encouragement of manufacturing with the protective system. I'd like to see a return to a productive economy over what we have, right now, the so-called fire economy, finance, insurance, and real estate, none of which is productive at all. I'd like to see Trump do protective tariffs over revenue tariffs, and hopefully in this speech we've gained a bit of a understanding of the difference. There was a bit of a controversy a little while ago about the H-1B visas and saying that these are skilled labor from overseas and we need them here because Americans don't know how to do these things. But why don't we have education and skills training? Why don't we have trying to develop the education and the skills of the population here? And then lastly, what I'll end on is, like we saw with FDR and JFK, they didn't focus so much on tariffs, but on great projects. What great projects could Trump try and initiate and then leave to his successor, presumably going to be J.D. Vance, to continue after he's gone? So the Artemis program, for example, Trump in his first term was very pro Artemis. And this would be a return to the moon with the ultimate goal of building a base on the moon. And we see a big alliance with Elon Musk and SpaceX and Tesla building AI robotic workers, which is going to be essential for any mission like this. I mean, a lot of the construction of the moon base will have to be done robotically because you don't have any food up there or anything for people to eat while they're working. You don't have, you have to build the infrastructure for humans to even be able to survive up there. And the only things that could survive up there to build it are things that don't need food, don't need water, things like that. So I think there's an enormous amount of potential there. Could we see, for example, Hamiltonian premiums or bounties for nuclear power? Encouraging the development of Generation 4, Generation 5 advanced fission reactors? Could we have a crash program for nuclear fusion, which, as you can see from this graph, the 1978 level of effort, aka fusion, never. Since about 1984, the level of fusion funding is actually drastically below that level. So could we scale back the military adventurism and then take some of that money and spend it at home on these kind of productive projects? Could we build a 21st century NWAPA? I mean, Trump's talking about California and these fires and, attacking Gavin Newsom. There's not enough water. Could that be a great project that we could all get behind and inspired by? So, that's the end of it. Just want to say thank you to EIR, especially Anton Chaikin, Jeffrey Steinberg, and Robert Ingraham. Without them, their research has just been so invaluable for all this.
Thank you, Sam. Yeah, man, you did it again. Every time I let you speak, you go and you do one of these encyclopedic, amazing reference pieces that are just these immortal ah gestalts to refer back to again and again and again. So I really do appreciate the thoroughness of this. And I think this was super appropriate because as people will discover in the ensuing weeks ahead, what you laid out as a scaffold, a thumbnail sketch of the entire sweep of the American experience will uh, create a context in which that mapping of context in the mind will get people to appreciate a lot more the thorough expositions that will be made by various chapters of the story that you painted in a brushstroke form just now. So that really great presentation. Okay, we got a few people who have questions to throw at you. I think there's a consensus that Richard Moore, who has a short question, will be the first to go at it, and then we'll go to Uwe, Stephen, Peter, Vic, a couple of others. But so, Richard, you get it first.
Yeah, thanks, Sam. That was absolutely wonderful presentation. I just have a little technical question. Lincoln's greenbacks, would you say they are consistent with MMT, modern monetary theory?
Well, MMT, the problem with MMT is there's no emphasis on productive investment. So as far as I understand, I'm not an expert on MMT, but as far as I understand, it's just general issuance of currency into the economy, which in theory is okay, but there's no separation of, well, we're directing this credit towards productive industries versus we're directing this credit towards the building of casinos or you know Wall Street banking houses, things like that. So that would be my main criticism of MMT.
So MMT plus the right policies would then be like the greenback. Okay,
Yeah, I think so.
thank you.
I would jump in quickly to caution you, Richard, from making the synonymous assumption that MMT plus the right policies makes the greenback, because in form, outward form, maybe you could get some of the same effects mechanically, but from the idea of substance, the higher principle where reality exists, I would say it's ontologically not compatible. That's a broader discussion. But Sam alluded to it for the reasons that Sam said, pertaining to the idea of recognizing the intrinsic principle of the mind as being the force that drives the entire economy and its power of leaping outside of itself to make more discoveries to increase the power of productivity. But that's what I would throw out there as a point of caution.
I'll also just say one more thing is that a paper currency is not necessarily good, and a gold-backed currency is not necessarily bad. We see from William McKinley the example of a juggernaut economy developing and steaming ahead even under the gold standard.
Mm, yeah, yeah, that's right. Good point. Peter. Oh no, sorry, not Peter, not yet. Uwe had a good question on World War One and Two. So Uwe, are you still there?
Yeah, I am. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, right. So, Sam, first of all, I apologize for in my presentation last week, I didn't recognize that the auto typo correction chopped up your name. So it is, of course, Labrier, and I knew that, but it was misspelled in the presentation. So I have a question and a comment. The question is pertaining to the flanking of the British Empire's naval base due to the land bridge routes for developing economies. And I had read, or I had begun to research, but I hadn't really completed due to other reasons, that the Berlin to Baghdad railway project in Europe, or in connecting Europe with Asia, had been a major role for World War One to be necessary to put pressure on Germany, even blame eventually with which followed after the Versailles Treaty. But is this something which you can confirm that Germany, under the, of course, the list American system, had built up so much economic power by the 1880s, which had brought Germany on on par with Britain already. And then the prospect of this prestigious project with the Berlin to Baghdad railway connecting and bypassing the Suez was a major reason to go to war with Germany and even make them be, the culprit for all of it. And then I have a comment afterwards on John J. McCloy.
Okay, well, I look forward to that comment. Definitely can confirm exactly what you just said. The British were extremely threatened by this new land route to Asia, which was the impetus was Otto von Bismarck, and then it's really the impact of having the bad leadership after the ouster of Bismarck that led directly to World War One, and this was sort of this flank opened up by the British to undo these gains that had been made. And it's very telling that, like World War One was such a disaster. I mean, if you look at 1880s and 1890s and the progress that was being made in Europe, and then you look at 1918, I mean, just millions of people slaughtered for nothing, for no reason. And World War One is the war that you ask people why it happened, nobody can really answer. But you have to understand that it was British maneuvering to make World War One happen, and then
Yeah.
you have to understand why all those countries specifically were the targets.
Mhm.
And it's very telling that the Berlin to Baghdad railroad was not completed until the 1940s, when it should have been, under Bismarck, it would have been completed within, a 5 year span or whatever, because just the degeneration that happened in Germany after the ouster of Bismarck and the poor leadership in Germany.
Yeah. So thank you for this confirmation, and I would definitely have to pick up my notes again to continue that piece. So the comment on John J. McCloy is something I got triggered to make this comment after you said we saw him afterwards in a number of dubious instances, such as the Warren Commission. I had, when I researched the piece on the connection between Montague Norman and Hjalmar Schacht pre-World War II, and then after unification, the godson of Hjalmar Schacht being in charge of deindustrializing East Germany for the Treuhandgesellschaft. And Norman von Scherpenbeck is the name of the guy who was in charge of that. But John J. McCloy, he had already been, he was relations to Konrad Adenauer, and many in Germany had, we were taught that Konrad Adenauer was this principled anti-Nazi politician who went into exile in a monastery during the Nazi period and was later Germany's conscience to be brought back in, which is quite a very biased prescription, because Adenauer was, his wife was the sister or cousin to John J. McCloy's wife. So they knew exactly whom they had. And Adenauer had been mayor of Cologne during the Weimar Depression period, where he sold infrastructure to Wall Street and got kickbacks, which is the reason why the Nazis went after him. So they did not go after him because he was a dissenter or opposition even, but because he wasn't playing nicely. The same with, for example, the Bertelsmann publishing group, which also was pursued by the Nazis, but only because they betrayed the army with paper contingencies. Anyway, so coming back to John J. McCloy and Adenauer, of course, we had a one-vote majority for Adenauer after 1984, 1949, 1948, the formation of the German Federal Republic. And this was very significant because had the climate been more transparent about Adenauer's involvement in all of this, he was friends with Kurt von Schröder, who also was the Nazi banker. He was friends with Ferd Menges, who was on the Kuhn-Loeb side doing business with London. So this was all very, very controlled. And Adenauer was brought in to prevent Kurt Schumacher becoming Chancellor, Social Democrat, which would have been very likely much like Italy's way out of control of the CIA, but they managed to rein it in, and Adenauer became Chancellor, and Globko, of course, was a leading Nazi in his chancellery, and Reinhard Gehlen, of course, was the one who conducted all the intelligence afterwards. So this is just a comment.
Well, yeah, I mean, you see John J. McCloy all over this modern treason faction. So I'm going to, when this is up, I'm going to go over all that again and research that, because that's very interesting.
Looking forward to your output.
All right. Jerry. No, not Jerry, not that, not ignore that. I miswrote down my list here. Steve, no, Peter. Peter's the next. Sorry.
Thanks, Matt, and thank you, Sam. Yeah, I heard a whole lot that you packed into this this session, and boy, is it timely. So I've got a question that goes back to history and a couple minor questions that arose from the presentation on McKinley. First, what is the nature of the operation to divide the GOP in 1912 by running TR versus Taft and Wilson to get Wilson into the White House by the Electoral College alone with only 41% of the popular vote, and then setting Wilson up to sign the 1913 Federal Reserve Act, which Taft opposed? My minor question is, when that article referred to McKinley's speech at the U of M, was that Michigan or was that Minnesota? Because I was taking a shot that it might have been Minnesota, because Teddy Roosevelt Speak Softly and Carey a Big Stick speech took place at the Minnesota State Fair in St. Paul in 1901 while he was still vice president. I await your answer.
Okay, very quick on U of M. I don't know. I was not able to figure out what the M stood for. I just found it was a great speech full of nice little snippets in favor of protection. And yeah, as far as I understand, so the Bull Moose ticket of 1912 was run by Wall Street. And don't forget, Teddy Roosevelt is a product of this same New York machine. In order to split the Republican vote to get Woodrow Wilson and the internationalist Woodrow Wilson in, who will sign the Federal Reserve Act. And they run this entire operation with the Pujo Commission to generate a bunch of anti-Wall Street sentiment in order to then so they changed tactics. They said, let's bring it in as an anti-Wall Street. We'll disguise it as like an anti-Wall Street measure, and then it'll gain popular support because the people are opposed to Wall Street. So if we say this measure is meant to be an anti-Wall Street measure, we might be able to gain popular support for it.
Yeah, it seems to have worked. And by the way, Uwe, in my godfather's household, Schacht was a four-letter word because he helped liberate Dachau, stayed behind as a lawyer, and helped prosecute Schacht. And the court of first instance in Germany found Schacht guilty after Nuremberg acquitted him. But then an appellate court reversed the conviction.
Oh, really? I never knew that. Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Is there anything written on that story, Peter? Because I haven't looked at that, and I find it juicy and fascinating. As far as classical tragedy is concerned, do you have
I
any?
wish I could
reference?
find it. I don't. Newton passed away in 1996, and I don't have his papers. If I could find something, I do know that. I do know that he worked with Victor Reuther to help rebuild the trade unions in Stuttgart. So maybe there's something there. His name might have been there.
Yeah, there is written material over the peculiarities of Schacht being acquitted. So I will have to look into my notes for the project with Vera. I can find some, I'm sure.
Yes,
Thank
please.
you. Gosh.
Yeah, we're all happy about that you just said that.
Thank you, Peter.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Stephen Doyle, where you
I'm
at?
here. I'm here.
Hey.
Thanks, Sam. Wonderful lecture. Really enjoyed it. Um, I'm going to try to tie in your title, which is Overcoming Oligarchy, with your, I think, thoughts of what Trump could be seeing for the future, the very positive stuff, the potential for fusion or whatever. And I'm going to ask a question in a little bit on what does Trump need to do to kind of bridge the gap between the current knowledge that the level you and Matt and others have and that vision of the future. But I'm going to kind of take a little different tact, and I'm going to bring in Carol Quigley's The Evolution of Civilization just for a little context. And if you haven't read it, I think you'd love the framework in terms of how to hang all the knowledge you have, all these events. But Quigley said around 1890, he started seeing for the third time Western civilization kind of going into this fourth middle stage of its evolution conflict where things start to go off the rails, where all these human system social instruments start becoming self-serving institutions. And we could just as easily substitute, I think, oligarchy for that in terms of who controls those self-serving institutions at this stage of the evolutionary cycle. And Quigley taught us that either three things happen historically. Either those self-serving interests get circumvented, either they get reformed, which seems to me what Trump and Doge is going to try to do, or the third one was reaction. The self-serving interest wins. And as Quigley pointed out, I think in the Roman times, the land reformers ended up on the wrong side of an assassin's dagger. So all the presidents who get assassinated kind of fit that pattern. My question is, if Trump has the level of understanding that we have, and I suspect he's a lot smarter and better informed than a lot of people give him credit for, if he has these noble visions of the future, like world fairs in a couple of years, it'll just amaze us. What does he have to do? Because he knows the nature of the system. He knows the nature of these narcissistic oligarchs. I'd assume he has an understanding, as Quan has said, that you'll always have and need the oligarchs. It's a question of them being aligned to the needs of society and the nation versus their own selfish narcissistic needs. What do you see happening in let's say the next couple of years in the US? If Trump has this level of understanding, what does he need to do to get to where he wants to go? How does he overcome these oligarchs?
Okay, so I have to be careful to not talk for another 2 hours on this because you have spoken on exactly the kind of theorizing that I love to occupy my brain with all the time. So starting off by key point, assuming Trump knows all this. I'm not saying Trump will do this, but if in a perfect ideal scenario, okay? So number one, I think that oligarchy is premised on control of finance and currency. And it's not necessarily military. The military comes after. It's a way of enforcing and maintaining their control. But the key feature of oligarchy is this parasitical control over your financial system and your economic system. So Trump would have to take on the Federal Reserve and Wall Street. And I don't know of any indication that he will do that, but in my view, that is something he would have to do. And this is key as well. If you understand the American system, Trump is the president. He's the executive. He's not the legislature. So there's some things he can do in executive orders, but it's very limited. And so there needs to be not just Trump in the White House, but there needs to be among the people a new renaissance in the House and Senate of people who are of the same mission of taking on the oligarchy and who recognize the importance of passing laws to take away this key financial power and restore the control over the nation's economy to the people and to the legitimate elected government in according to the Constitution. So that would be number one. Then beyond that, I would say yes, you need to have a return to the American system of protective tariffs and encouraging a productive economy as opposed to the fire economy that we have now that will um, not just build wealth, but will also build up the citizenry themselves, will um, create new infrastructure that um, the entire economy can operate on that will make our lives better, and also new discoveries, new scientific progress that enriches our lives, that gives us possibilities now that we don't even have today because we weren't aware of them. Nuclear fusion would be just one great example. Um, so that would be where I go with that answer, to try and not go on for a few hours. Because I mean, like you said, like overcoming oligarchy, that's like my entire raison d'être in life. I mean, it's the question that occupies my mind more than any other, is like, how do we eliminate oligarchy? Can we ever eliminate oligarchy? And I know what you're saying, what Kwan says, but I think what Kwan is saying that is that you're always going to have an aristocracy in the very Greek sense of the word,
True.
like rule by the best. I don't think there's anything wrong with that necessarily, but I think that oligarchy is, it needs to be, as much as possible, their nexus of power in financial control needs to be eliminated and subverted.
Okay. Excellent answer, and I agree with everything you said. The only thing I'd add as a last thought, I think to get to that stage where we're doing that, especially if you look at the crimes of the pandemic and Dr. David Martin and the vaccines and all that, the term genocide has been used. I think something analogous to Bukele in El Salvador has to happen in the U.S., and that's just my personal view. I don't know if that will happen or not, but I think the rot is that deep that it needs a deep cleansing. And I don't know if you would agree with that or not. And not that I'm hoping for anything traumatic, just that when I look at the big picture, to get to that vision you have, which is a really beautiful vision, and God bless you for working towards it, and everyone else. Being ex-military, I see the need for that deep intervention to really get the bad actors out and the criminal networks. Don't know if you agree or not, or even
That
what comment,
is that is that the Bitcoin thing in El Salvador? Is there something else? I'm not fully aware of El
no,
Salvador, what's
I
going
believe
on.
it didn't get a lot of airplay here, but I believe he declared a national emergency and used the army to crack
Oh
down on the
yeah.
MS-13
On
type activists and so
corruption.
on.
Yeah.
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 I
And
did see that. Well,
I
that's
just,
definitely necessary, but I mean, that's again something you would need a patriotic Congress, right? It's
yep,
not just Trump. Trump by
absolutely,
himself, he can't do much. So
absolutely.
there needs to be a renaissance among the people of finding these candidates in each House district and for each senator who are going to help bring this to fruition with Trump in the executive.
Yeah.
And we only have 2 years, right? Because like the next House election and then Trump's out after that, right? And hopefully Vance continues on, and hopefully, I mean, there's some questions about Vance and his ties, like Peter Thiel, for example. Um, Hopefully Vance is not a Lyndon Johnson or a Teddy Roosevelt, that if they take Trump out, a bad vice president, but it's still hope for the best, but not clear yet.
Yeah. I've got faith that Mr. Trump probably has a deep understanding that he's generally given credit for. Maybe I'm being idealistic or naive, but I'm hopeful.
No, same. Maybe I'm idealistic as well, but I am hopeful as well. And I know that, I mean, even Elon Musk has a ton of skeletons in his closet and issues, and nobody's perfect, I just hope that, I mean, like Elon Musk, yeah, he has some bad things. He says some good things. So I'm hoping that the good wins out.
Yeah, me as well. Okay.
He's pro people, for example. He says the world is becoming depopulated and we need more people. I see
And
that
he,
as pro, but is it like from this technocratic standpoint of his grandfather, and there's all these questions about his lineage and stuff, so
well,
we'll
you know,
see.
he's calling out the British government on the grooming gangs too. So he's focusing on some huge issues that would undermine some oligarchical actors, for lack of a better term.
Yeah,
Okay, I'm with you. Thanks very much. Really appreciate the lecture and the answer.
thanks, Stephen.
Hey, we got Vic has a really good question that I'd like to see how you address this. So Vic, are you still there?
Dude,
Hello?
can you hear me? Yeah.
Yeah, there you
Actually,
are. Hey.
let me just make a comment. It was an absolute excellent presentation. As Matt knows, on just some text that I don't see how FDR was an American systems guy, but your discussion of the protective tariff versus the revenue tariff actually reinforced my position that FDR was the exact opposite of the American systems guy, for two reasons. First off, quickly, I think the businessman plot was a false flag. I mean, everybody knows Benedict Arnold, but compared to what the businessmen were trying to do, he was a much greater traitor, and he's just not taught. So why did it get erased from history, and who went to jail for it and everything? But secondly, with regards to your tariff concept, um, it seems to me if you've got control of your protective tariff properly, you don't need a huge administrative state to micromanage all aspects of business or everything, which was basically what the New Deal started. And every businessman knows it's a lot easier to buy off one, government bureaucrat in Washington than try to work 50 deals with 50 different states. Anyway, that's just kind of a general statement. I mean, if COVID showed completely that, regulatory capture of just Washington basically ruined the world. But anyway, that's actually not my question. Again, I hadn't even thought about, hey, if you can control it with protective tariffs, you don't need micromanaging. But here's my real question. I look at um, Roosevelt as a warmonger of the first order. I mean, he was talking about war in 37 and in 38. We were running a completely illegal war in the North Atlantic. I mean, we invaded Iceland as part of the American thing, which was solely to protect the British Empire. We were doing all kinds of cheating on Lend-Lease. Regardless of what your opinion on the war was, 80% of the people were opposed to it. That's certainly not somebody that's following the Constitution. And also, the McCullum memo, which was a setup on how to get Japan to attack us so we could go into war with Germany. Um, to me, the American system first is no entangling alliances, because war is always the death of freedom. And then you can worry about the rest of your business. But the minute you go to war, everything goes out the window. So how do you square that the circle that he was a huge warmonger, but he was also American system?
Well, it's a great question. First thing I would say is you have to understand 1932, what FDR was coming into, and the level of despair amongst the population. I mean, we have records from JP Morgan executives sponsoring fascism in Italy, for example. Like, the whole plan of this treason faction was destroy the economy, lead to this level of despair, which will allow for all these desperate, starving people to be recruited and organized into this fascist mob that will take over the constitutional system, just like we're doing in Europe. So, without that understanding of what FDR was coming into, you can say, oh, well, FDR, he's bad because he came in and he started reorganizing the economy, and he started, putting people back to work, and it's not the government's job to do that. You're right. It's not generally, and in general, I'm fairly centrist. I mean, I'm for the private sector doing a lot of things, but it was an emergency situation in 1932. And I mean, there's been tons written about this, but they admit themselves not all of their policies worked, but their approach was to just keep trying because the alternative was more depression, more desperation, and more chance of these Wall Street guys organizing a fascist coup in the United States. Now, in terms of being a warmonger, I'm not aware of everything that you mentioned, like the McCulloch memo. I do know that there's some questions about how much we were putting economic pressure on Japan that forced them to attack at Pearl Harbor, because Pearl Harbor really changed the perception of the population and all of a sudden wanted to go and sign up to go and fight overseas. So I agree that there may have been some maneuvering to force Japan's hand there. But what is the alternative? What are they fighting over in Europe? Like what's happening? Are you going to allow the Nazis to take over Europe and just stay over in North America and say, yeah, we're not Europe. Eventually it's going to come home to you as well. They're going to take over all of Western Europe. Then they're going to take over the Soviet Union. Then they're going to move into North Africa and the Middle Eastern oil fields and just start dominating the resources of the entire world. And then how does the US defeat them?
Okay, well, first off,
Right?
you might want to look at was it Hitler, Churchill, and the unnecessary war. Basically, if we hadn't backed the UK, they would have worked. I believe they would have done peace with the Nazis, and he would have just gone east, not west. But let me go. Definitely look up
Actually, Vic, on that note here, there's a few images I'm just sharing right now, featuring declassified documents from 1940, featuring Nazi plans to use their basings in South America that they've been building up to invade the United States. There's six different scenario plans that one of them involved Iceland and Greenland takeover, and then an entry through Canada.
They
Through the
couldn't
British
possibly get
Empire
over
was
the-
allied to.
Anyway,
Well, they were sponsoring Nazi
again,
Germany. So there
and
were
how-
these open plans in 1940 that were being declassified, including in Japan, that the British had orchestrated in 1905
Sure.
for Japan to take control of and invade the United States through
Right.
Hawaii, that the
But-
British had given to the Japanese empire. So just so you know that that's out there. It's
No,
not like they were
I-
pacifist or they were going to leave the U.S. alone. It was well known
well,
back then that was the program to take over the U.S. and destroy it. So just so
but
you know
bear
that was a thing.
Bear in mind the rationale for the McCollum memo was it says this is how we get Japan to attack us so we can go to war with Germany. But the fundamental basis is we were punishing Japan for their behavior in China. Well, again, if you're the American system, it's not your job to be the cop of the world. So the core basis of what they were saying was somehow, after 7 years of Japan being invaded or China being invaded by Japan, we put conditions on them. Again, that's not the American system. But back to the matter at hand, though. Again, he was talking war in 37 and 38 while his economy was still back to, what was it, 14 or 16% unemployment, and things were nefarious. So, you make some points about how Wall Street was certainly impacting that. But are you also familiar with Operation Snow? That's a critical thing. Harry Dexter
Well,
White.
do you want to let Sam address the first part of?
Okay,
of
sure. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No. Let's let him go on. I want to
Okay.
hear this
All right.
last part, and then we'll.
Okay.
Well, yeah, look up the McCollum memo. It didn't get declassified till 1995, so it didn't get written into a lot of the history. But there was Harry Dexter White was actually an active communist agent, and he was ordered to create a second front with the U.S. getting in war with Japan, so the Soviets didn't have to have another Japanese uh, uh, Siberian war. But in any case, my whole point though is
But the Soviets were our ally at that
not
time,
not at
right?
that time. They were allied when that started. They were allied with Germany. Remember, they cut up Poland. They
Oh,
didn't. They
sorry. So
didn't.
what year? So what year is this?
I think it was in the fall of 40. Might have been in the summer of 40. Operation Snow is a good one. Harry Dexter White was critical, and so was Alger Hiss, in putting in the conditions in the McCollum memo that squeezed Japan into getting into war with us. But uh, but again, let's just go to the key point, though. Again, entangling alliances. To be truthful, hell. Uh, the Nazis couldn't get across the English Channel to think they could get across, the Atlantic Ocean when America was there and had time to prepare. To me, it was just things on a map. And to think Japan, I mean, what were they, 1/13 of our uh, GDP or something? That, yeah, they could do a sneak attack, but hell, they couldn't even invade and control Midway or Guam, and they certainly didn't get Hawaii. But anyway, my whole point though is it seems to me that FDR was definitely what I would consider a warmonger, and that the first thing of the American thing is no entangling alliances. That said, though, I really enjoyed your presentation, particularly, the understanding of protective tariffs. I mean, if you do your tariffs right, do you even need a bureaucracy to control your manufacturing sector? Won't the tariffs kind of drive, let the people decide? But anyway, I went way too long here. I really didn't mean to go off on all that. But it's just, I look at FDR very, very differently. I mean, the fact that nobody got hung for the businessman plot when, every American was taught, Benedict Arnold, which is, amazingly was probably a lot less impact, and it got written out of history. And it's like, why would it get written out of history? Because I mean, it was so positive for the guy, for the government Democrat historian, things they could use it. Hell, think if they were able to claim every time. Trump turned around, it's a businessman's plot, and just saying, he's a Nazi or a fascist or, whatever else they wanted to call him. If the businessman plot had been ingrained in the American people, it would be a stick that you could beat any opponent to big government forever to death with.
I
So,
agree with you that I mean, ideally, the people involved would have been sent to jail or, executed for treason, whatever. Was it politically possible given, the juice that somebody like JP Morgan had? I don't know. Given the evidence that they had, that's a completely separate question. And I, in terms of the protective tariff, I'll just say really quick, like the free trade or laissez-faire argument is often that it will produce too much of a bureaucracy to oversee, all of the tariffs that have to be um, imposed on imports at, every port. But I do agree with you that it's preferable to a complete laissez-faire free trade system. And I appreciate what you said, and I'm going to look into the things that you mentioned, but I just want to say that just because FDR wanted to go to war with fascism in Europe and their allies in Japan, I don't necessarily think that makes him a warmonger. That's that's just without without having read what you mentioned, which I am going to go and check out. Um, I think that the fascist machine, which was largely a creation of Wall Street and the British, by the way, um, until it turned west and started, coming against them, it did have to be destroyed.
Oh, believe me, I saw it as ultimate evil too, but it our evil? But anyway, again, I've taken up way too much of your time, and like again, you've taught me a huge amount about the history of America, and obviously I read a fair,
Awesome, Vic.
and
Awesome. I'm really glad to hear that.
so thank you very much.
It was my pleasure. I'm glad you liked it.
Magdalena.
Hi. Okay.
Hey.
So finally got able to unmute myself. So just, by the way, just a previous discussion, which wasn't mentioned so much, but there was also a very big pro-Nazi sentiment in the United States too. Okay. And so Nazism was not just part of Europe. Okay, there was a very big support network in the United States. So I just want to throw that into that discussion as well.
And Canada as well.
Yes, absolutely. Okay, absolutely. Now, I just wanted to mention, you talked about Albert Gallatin. And you referred to him as being a Swiss. And I take very big opposition to that because he was not Swiss. Okay.
Okay.
He was Genevan. Geneva did not become part of the Swiss Confederation till 1814.
Oh,
Okay.
technicality. What
No,
was it
big
before
one.
then?
Again,
What
no,
was it
no,
before
no.
then?
It's a city. It was a city state.
Oh, interesting.
It was a
Okay.
city
Okay.
state, okay? So I know nowadays the Swiss are very proud of claiming Gallatin as one of their own, but he was not, okay? And I'm being a patriot here for Switzerland. I'm saying, no, I don't want any part of this guy as being referred to Switzerland, as being a Swiss. Okay, so that's just what I wanted to say. And otherwise, thank you so very much. It was a very illuminating presentation, and you set it up very nicely for me. When I'm giving my presentation later on I'm going to go much more in detail about Teddy Roosevelt. So thank you for setting that up for me.
I cannot wait.
So no more Gallatin us being Swiss, please.
Genevan, I got it. I got it. Okay.
Okay.
Thank you for that corrective, Magdalena. Very much appreciated. And we look forward to your class on March 30th coming up. All right, that's on the menu. Jerry is next.
Oh, thanks, Matt. And thanks, Sam. That was another great class from a fellow compatriot. And I think it's just so important right now in Canada because there's so much talk about Trump and tariffs. And let's be honest, most Canadians don't have the foggiest idea about tariffs. We're so uneducated. And I think you did a great service in teaching us the difference between a protective tariff and revenue tariff. That was well done. Now, my question, you did mention Frederick List, and he's coming to the United States and going back to Germany. And I wanted to ask you if you've done more work, more reading on List and the idea of the Zollverein. Because as you showed, the same way protective tariffs can be used to protect your labor force and also to unify the country, that when List went back to Germany, there wasn't a country. It was, a million different pieces.
Yeah.
So he set up the Zollverein as not really a free trade zone, but as a customs union. So these little, principalities could get together, but along the same principle, as you said, to protect your workforce, protect labor, and also to unify the country. Because I think, our problem in Canada, we probably have more trade restrictions between provinces than we do with other countries. And I think our best response to any tariffs from Trump would be to form a better Zollverein in Canada. I think Trump's tariffs would be great for us, because the whole NAFTA thing was just to destroy our workforce and have everybody working for minimum wage somewhere. So, but anyway, my question is, I wanted to know if you've done more work on List and on the Zollverein issue. Thank you.
Well, I mean, I don't fully know what you mean by done more work, but I do know of Friedrich List's influence on what became the Zollverein. And you're right, Germany was like this stitched together quilt of hundreds of principalities, and they're all like just controlling their own tiny little territory. And then Verein means like united, right? So it was like they were all united in this border through which you could now tariff whatever's coming into this area as a proto nation, like before the official German nation was created, 1871, I think. That, and it was, I think it was largely Prussia that it drove it initially, because they were the center of production and industry at that time, and they wanted to copy the American system, protective system of developing your manufacturers. In more than that, like very, very in depth on the Zollverein, no, I haven't done. Like I would love to, maybe as part of this series of articles I'm doing, have one where you really go in depth on it. Is there anything you can educate me on the Zollverein, or is it a hole in your knowledge as well?
Well, unfortunately, most of what I knew about the Zollverein, I forgot. But I know when I read about it, I was very much impressed by it.
Yeah, and you see the American system spreading.
Yeah, but even like instead of I think certain Canadians wanted to have a Zollverein with the United States, that you could have free trade between Canada and the United States, but then you would have a common tariff system against foreign dumping, which is totally different than NAFTA. So that's what I was looking at it from. I know Laurier had similar tendencies in that direction. His idea of trade with the United States was this form of a Zollverein. He called it reciprocity, but the British had a different idea about reciprocity. It was, revenue tariffs. But
right, until he was thrown out and said the country's now run by the Round Table.
Exactly. So I think that was maybe the last time a positive idea of tariffs was in Canada under.
And we'll see. I mean, with Trump saying the 51st state and Governor Trudeau, and where is this going? Where are we going? There could be some positives, but I mean, would we be under the Constitution? Would we still be two separate nations? Would we keep our healthcare? Would we be under the CIA and the Federal Reserve? I mean, there's pros and cons,
Yeah, would the crown still be the thing? Would
yeah.
we be free of that or not? Is it going to be a trick to just absorb the U.S. into, the old Aaron Burr plan of join the crown colonies of the North of 1800? Is that like a trap? I don't know. Like, these are all
we don't
questions.
get the Constitution; they get the BNA Act.
Yeah, right. God forbid. All right,
God forbid, yeah.
Let's round this out with Monty. Monty, I know has some positive thoughts here. So, Monty, what are you thinking about?
All right. Well, thank you. My personal opinion on Trump in Canada, I think he was trolling big time. And what it does, it brings up a conversation as to the independence of Canada. That's my thought on that. But More interesting to this, I brought this up in a previous discussion. It's something that Matt addressed that just has me thinking. And it's this idea of getting inside Trump's mind and heart in flanking him in some way. You know, he doesn't have as the chief executive officer, he does have executive action capability, not so much legislature, and he requires the Congress behind him to legislate, but he has very powerful means to bring things to people's attention insofar as foreign and domestic policy, in particular development. And I was
Certainly
most
foreign, yes. Certainly foreign, yeah.
yeah, and I think even domestically he has that power. And one thing that Matt brought up in one of his presentation was this idea. You know, we know the Bering Strait thing failed. We know Nawapa failed. We know, you know, they were sabotaged after over periods of time. But one thing Matt brought up that just fascinated me, as I thought would be a means of a flank for Trump's mind and heart, would be this idea of the A2P, the Alaska to Alberta Railway, which would it was proposed. I developed, I think, on in 2015. It had about a $17 billion budget, which is a pittance compared to the hundreds of billions of dollars we put into war and the fires and everything. The payback would actually work. But Trump actually approved of this as the president in July of 2020, which shows he's thinking about something. And I think it would be an excellent proof of principle and would also lead into the idea as so far as the viability of much bigger things like Nawapa, like the Bering Strait Tunnel, and like a connection with the BRICS and a cooperate. You know, he's going to see Xi Jinping. He made a phone call. So I think just appreciate your opinion on this, but I think it would be an excellent flank to get inside the people around Trump and get thinking about something that would have massive appeal, I think, insofar as the proof of principle of infrastructure development, and would also line up mostly with the patriots in Canada on this subject. So any thoughts you had on that, I would appreciate.
Yeah, I think that just connecting Alaska to Alberta won't freak out the oligarchy that much. But if it's used as the first branch to then connect with a Bering Strait tunnel to Russia, that will be the biggest freak out that you've ever seen. And Trump will have such a massive fight on his hands. A good fight, a fight that you want to take. I mean, something that you're working towards that's positive, and a rapprochement with Russia and China. I mean, Trump, one of my favorite things Trump says, and he hasn't said it so much in this election cycle, but he definitely said it in 2016. He said it all the time. He said, better relations with Russia and China is a good thing, not a bad thing. And it's so true. So my hope would be that it would be the first step towards a massive infrastructure project, bringing those countries together in economic development to help ensure against war in the future.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Monty.
And thank you. Thank you, Sam. That was great. That was really great. So I think that, yeah, that, like I said, sets the stage for so many classes that are going to come in the weeks ahead. Mel K will be doing next week's lecture. She'll be introducing her some of the concepts she developed in her book, Saving the Republic, which will be at 2 p.m. usual time. And then after that, we're going to have classes from Anton Chaikin, a couple of the Holmes family young ones who have been doing a lot of work on FDR, the New Deal, Lincoln's greenbacks, a lot more. So yeah, a lot to come. And I think, again, this is a great manifesto. You set the stage beautifully. This will be uploaded in the next 24 hours with a bunch of links underneath for people who want to do a bit more digging, including links to your previous lectures that I think are must watches, especially your stuff on LaRouche and Vernadsky. I think was just fantastic as supplements to what this was. But yeah, Sam, this is great, man. So thank you so much. And thank you everybody for sharing this Sunday with us.
Thank you, my friend. It was a great honor. Thank you for the opportunity.
Okay. Thank you.